Amazing. So welcome everyone to the Economics Revision series. Really excited to be here today to give you guys some pieces of advice and have a bit of a look over the content that we've got for Economics 3-4, and of course hear from some of the fantastic volunteers that we've got on today to answer some of your questions for Q&A. So I'm really excited to go through this session with you all. I suppose as a bit of a heads up, the session is designed to be super interactive. If you do have any questions that pop up throughout, please go ahead and ask them. We've got a Menti link that I'll chat about in a sec. But yeah, this is really supposed to help you revise for the exams and get ready to go for that sort of trickier end of year period. So excited to help you along with that journey. We don't want more music. Before we jump into the event today, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we're gathered on today. I pay my respects to the elders, past and present, as they hold the memories, traditions, a culture, and the hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the nation. I'd also like to acknowledge UBS and thank them for their support throughout this program. They're one of the incredible sponsors for the revision series, and that's going to allow Skyline to run the series for VCE students. So we've got some volunteers on today who I'll introduce in a bit, so they're going to be helping answer some of your questions. As a bit of a heads up for Zoom etiquette, so we are on a sort of Zoom webinar, but I would ask you to keep yourself muted and keep your camera off just to minimize any sort of distractions. Please use the Zoom chat for sort of immediate questions only. So I really encourage you to ask some of those questions that you have for Q&A that might be related to how to study for economics and more content related questions. Keep those over in the Menti. That will allow us to basically see those questions and allow me to answer them and sort of share that knowledge with you all. But if you've got like a technical difficulty, for instance, you can't hear me or there's something going on with the Zoom, feel free to use that Zoom platform to let me know. And we've got the Mentimeter. So basically the Mentimeter, you can go to menti.com. I'll have a QR code pop up in a sec, but this is the code that you can enter. So throughout today's session, we're going to be having, again, that Q&A throughout, but we've also got a bit of a quiz that we're going to have during the middle of the lesson and some other questions just to gauge how you're going with economics so far and get you involved in the webinar. So just a bit of a heads up about Skyline Hatch. So we provide weekly tutoring classes, VCE master classes, and also VCE mindset programs like Stress Hack. And the reason why Skyline is so amazing is because it is led by really recent high achieving graduates who really smashed their time in school. And there's this unique combination of group and one-on-one tutoring. So it's a really awesome opportunity to get involved in a variety of different ways. And we're also a social enterprise. So all of the profits are invested right back into the Skyline Education Foundation. So you can find out a little bit more about Skyline Hatch by visiting the website here or just popping it into your browser as well. So just to give you a bit of a rundown of what we're going to go through today, I like sort of blocking things out. So today we're going to be going over a bit of a welcome, some housekeeping stuff, and then we're going to have a bit of a look at some study tips for studying specifically for that economics exam. And then very relevant to the economics exam, we're going to be having Q&A with an economist from UBS who will be joining us today. In the next block, I'm going to go through the study design. So this is just going to be running through the general points of content and some things to look out for, and just me giving you a bit of an overview of some more common questions. We'll have a bit of a break and some time for Q&A, and we'll be jumping into some practice questions after that, having another break, and then the last block is to help you get ready for the exam and get up to date with some of the knowledge that you need, because the economics exam is a little bit more tricky than just knowing content. We need to be super up to date with what's going on in the economy as well. Awesome. So before we jump in to the intro, I'm just going to introduce myself and the volunteers that we've got on. So my name is Bridget. I graduated in 2018 and I'm currently studying a Bachelor of Commerce. So I'm majoring in economics and finance. So I've done a bit of further study in economics, and I've got a picture of my cat there basking in the sun, having a good time. And today joining us as well, we have Ivy, Serena, and Nick. So I might pass over to you guys. Ivy, if you wanted to do a quick intro to yourself now.
Yeah, so hey everyone, I'm Ivy. I'm currently studying IT at Monash and I'm in my third year. Although I don't have any background in economics, I'm happy to answer any questions to do with uni and studying. I'll be here as the assistant tutor today, so I'm supporting Bridget as well as our wonderful UBS volunteers, Serena and Nick.
Hi guys, I'm Serena, one of the UBS volunteers. I graduated last year from high school and I did the HSC rather than the VCE, but my subjects included economics and it was one of my favorites. So right now in uni, I'm doing a Bachelor of Commerce with a major in economics and finance. So I'd be very happy to answer any questions you have about the HSC or the exam process, and also anything about going into uni and stuff like that.
All right. So, yep, I'm Nick Geno. I work at UBS as an economist. I graduated from Sydney Uni, where I studied a Bachelor of Economics a couple of years ago. And after I graduated, I went to work at Commonwealth Bank as an economist as well, covering the Australian economy. So if you do have any questions about current trends or things you're interested in a broader economic sense, I'm definitely happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, that's really awesome. I mean, like one of the really key things about the economics exam is having that knowledge of current trends. So definitely make sure you ask some questions to Nick, everyone, because he has some really amazing knowledge that will be super, super useful for the exam. So thanks so much for joining us today, everyone. So the first thing that I want to do before we jump into anything is to have a bit of a sense of how you're feeling about the economics exam. So if you jump onto menti.com and use the code, we've got the question there. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling about the economics exam? And I'll switch over to that poll to see how we're going. If I can figure out. Go. Amazing. So 4.5, 4.4, not too bad. Looks like we've got some people who are feeling like a bit of a pro, but a lot of people in the middle. Looks like we're getting a bit more confident, but definitely a bit of a mixed bag. I would say can definitely relate. I think at this point in the year when I was doing my VCE, it was definitely not feeling super, super confident. And I'm sure most people who've gone through that process can agree. I think at this point of the year, a lot of the things that you've kind of learned and done throughout the year might be a little bit lost on you by this point because you're kind of in that in-between period. Maybe you haven't started studying for those exams, but you've done all your assessments, you've learned all the content. It's just not super fresh, especially the stuff that came more at the start of the school year. So it looks like we're kind of leveled out, but hopefully we can get this rating up by the end of today's session. So I'll switch back over to the slides. And again, feel free, looks like most of you have been able to get onto the Menti. There is that sort of Q&A function. So please feel free, go ahead and ask some questions on there. You can do that throughout at any point. So if you've got a question that you want to ask now, go ahead and we'll take those questions in the break time and the Q&A time that we've got coming up. Awesome. So basically today's lesson is designed to be quite well-rounded in terms of all the things that you have to do for economics. Like I mentioned, economics isn't one of those subjects where you can simply learn the content and memorize a bunch of facts and kind of sit the exam and be done with it. It does require a little bit more involvement, which I think makes it a more worthwhile and valuable subject, because not only do you learn about these key points within the economy, but you also learn a little bit more about current trends and everything that's going on, including things like the budget and just generally how economies over the world are performing. So while it might not seem super fun to have to remember all the stats and kind of do that research initially, I think it is really valuable. So that is definitely a good mindset to go into, I guess, when you go into studying for economics. So yeah, essentially today, the way I've designed the lesson is so that we'll talk about sort of your study technique and how to best revise for your exam at the start. Then I'm going to be going over the content. You do need to know how to relate that sort of knowledge and those learnings to actual questions that you're going to be asked. Then we're going to go through some practice questions, so how you actually take that content and put it onto the paper in the form that an examiner likes to see it in and will give you full marks for. And then at the end, we're going to be looking at some prep, so about the Australian economy over the last 2 years, and some sort of like exam techniques and a bit of a roadmap leading up to your exam. So I guess we can jump into the first block now, which is how to best study for the economics exam. So I've kind of broken this down into my top 10 tips, and these like pieces of advice are definitely not going to be suited for everyone. So I would just encourage you to take the pieces of advice that you find valuable and absolutely feel free to leave the rest. When it comes to study technique, it is really up to the individual. Do what works for you, but hopefully you can find some pieces of advice in here that might be helpful for you leading up to the economics exam and any similar subjects as well. So the first tip number 1 is the study design is your best friend. So it pretty much just has all the answers to the exam. Of course, there's a bit of a caveat on that, in that, you do need to kind of know a little bit more in depth about the dot points, but the point is that they can't really ask you questions that aren't on the study design. And even if they did, that would be super mean, and they'd probably have to give you marks because you wouldn't have been able to know it in the first place. So I would really recommend, we're going to look at it in today's lesson, but print it out, download it, have a copy of it, whatever you need to do, just so that you can kind of reference it for your note taking and for your future reference when it comes to the studying that you're going to do for economics over the next few weeks. And just make sure that you've downloaded the correct copy of the study design. It was different for 2020, so they did change up a couple of dot points, but we have reverted back to the old one. So just make sure you're referencing the correct study design. Might seem a bit like basic, but some of the resources that you would have looked at in class might have been more tailored to last year. So just be super wary of that. But I'd really recommend having that study design because it kind of guides your revision and gives you a bit more structure to what you need to know, which I find to be quite helpful if you can kind of compartmentalize everything based on the dot points. The next tip that I have is to develop a study technique. And this is one of, I think, the most important things about, I guess, studying for exams and any kind of studying and school in general. It's really good to have like a formula or a technique that helps you study, that might be your sort of go-to when you're leading up to some kind of assessment, whether that be like a SAC or exam, or even something else that you do that's assessment related later down the line. The reason why I say that it's important to have like a study technique or routine is because you really want to have some steps in place that allow you to kind of prove to yourself that you can trust yourself to study in the lead up to a SAC or exam. I find that in the instances where I felt like I wasn't in some kind of like routine or didn't have some key like check boxes, like to-do list items that I needed to do, I didn't really feel like I was well prepared enough, and I didn't trust that I had studied enough to do well in this particular assessment. But if I was able to sort of plan out, these are my go-to things that I do leading up to every SAC or leading up to every exam, I can sort of like know that if I do all of those things, I'm going to have a really good shot at doing the best that I possibly can in that assessment, which is really the best that you can do. So for me, that kind of came in 3 different steps. And I'm sure that there's like different pieces of advice and different steps that you can follow. But the first thing that I do when it comes to studying, and the first thing that I did for year 12 economics, was to summarize the content. So to have really nice summaries that effectively put all of that information that I would want to have in my brain come exam time into one place. So whether that be like in a like really aesthetically pleasing summary notebook, that's totally fine. If you want some sort of like Pinteresty, beautiful looking notes, you could just have it in a Word document that's just like a big load of text. But basically you want to be within your summaries, like basing it off the study design and using all your resources to fully flesh out a nice set of notes that, you know, you would ideally have remembered come exam time. And the next step is using some kind of active recall strategy to put that information that you would want to have in your brain come exam time into your brain. So for that, I really recommend the technique of active recall. You could definitely Google this. I'm not going to sort of like go into too much detail, but you basically might have seen this in like other pieces of advice and like study videos or something like that. But basically the idea is that if you are able to actively recall something through doing things like flashcards and doing practice questions, rather than doing things like rereading your notes or reading the textbook, you're actually forcing yourself to remember and recall that information rather than simply recognizing it. So it's really easy sometimes if you've read something like 3 or 4 times, you might think like, that's fine, I know that information. But if you actually were given, or you were given some kind of situation where you'd have to recall that information, it's much harder to do that. So that's where using techniques like having flashcards and all of that is really important. And so I made Quizlet decks for me. And the last step is to practice. So now at this point, you've got all the information you want to have in your brain. Now you need to go ahead and convert that information into the form that the examiners want to see it in the final exam. So that's when practice questions and practice exams come into play. So thankfully, VCAR publish all of their past practice or past actual exams that students have had to sit. So you can simply hop onto the VCAR website, and you're able to see all of those exams, and I suppose more importantly, the marking scheme and how they've been marked in the past. So you're able to kind of see where students went wrong and try and avoid making those mistakes again. So they're really, really useful to do. The next tip for economics is to get comfortable with the economy over the past 2 years. So this takes the form of multiple things within the economy, but I suppose in a general sense, you want to be really comfortable with some key economic indicators. So the ones that we especially look at in 3-4 economics are your sort of like really classic indicators of the economy that are GDP growth, inflation, and unemployment. But you also want to have statistics for other elements of the economy that we look at in other areas of study. So if we're looking in an aggregate demand sense, looking at things like household income, consumer confidence, business confidence, etc. And if we're looking at things that have to do with Australia and the rest of the world, we want to be looking at things like exchange rates, for instance, and the terms of trade, which are all included as dot points in the study design. So we need to know about what they are, but it's also important to know what they have been over the past couple of years for Australia to, I suppose, give you a bit more context to what you're actually learning. The next thing that you need to know with the economy over the past 2 years would be sort of budgetary policies that relate to aggregate demand and aggregate supply. In order for me to remember the stats, it's not that fun to remember a bunch of stats and have a bit of an idea of how things were over the past couple of years, especially when you don't necessarily have a lot of information going into it. I know for me personally in economics, I was like really worried about not knowing enough about the economy because like the situation I was in, obviously in high school, wasn't really dealing with that sort of stuff in my everyday life by any means. But what I would recommend is just reading like a few news articles about the economy. It doesn't have to be something that you do every single day, but it is useful just to give you a bit more context. And when it comes to actually remembering the statistics, I liked to make Quizlet decks or like flashcard decks that basically contained those key indicators that I was looking at and gave me the specific numbers for the past 2 years of time. So I think I would have done like I did them as of October 2018, which is when I sat my exam. I had statistics for October 2018, for October 2017 and 2016. So capturing the last 2 years. And I also included a bit of a graph so that I could kind of visualize how things were moving over that time. And it gave me some really good context to be able to answer some of the trickier questions that actually ask you to draw on that information. For instance, questions that might ask you to list a factor that might have led to worse GDP growth over the past year or something like that. And the best ways of sourcing this, I find, are through the RBA and the ABS. They've got some really great websites for the stats. The next economics tip and just general high school / VCE tip would be to kind of forget about your SACs. So I know that there's a lot of emphasis placed on your performance in the coursework that you do throughout the year, and it is really important. I think for me, the most important thing about SACs is that they really give you the opportunity to constantly be assessed on the different like pieces of content that you need to know. So really for me, what I would see SACs as would be revision throughout the year, essentially. They kind of act as little checkpoints along the way. But in my opinion, they by no means define the mark that you're going to get at the end of the year. So in my experience, I know a lot of my friends had really like SAC marks that they weren't really happy with, but they studied really hard for those final year exams and ended up doing really well. Some of them did better than some of the people who had like potentially better SAC marks. For me, in my experience and what I've sort of learned talking to students and teachers, when it comes to the like weighting of SACs versus exam, I think that having a focus on really putting your energy and time into smashing that exam and not worrying about what your SAC marks have been so far, that is the best possible strategy that you can have leading up to that exam. It kind of sounds a bit scary, definitely. So if you kind of have the idea that, you know, your SACs don't matter, it all comes down to your exam, that puts a lot of pressure on that final year exam. The two things that I would say about that are, number one, everyone is under that exact same amount of pressure. Everyone gets the exact same exam. If it's a really hard exam, everyone is going to have to deal with that. They're going to have to deal with maybe not knowing about some questions, maybe making up some like interesting answers, but it's going to be the exact same across the board. Like as cliched as it is, you're all in the same boat when it comes to that exam. And the next thing is that when it like comes to the exam, it is a little bit more standardized than your SACs. They're marked by lots of people, and typically the like difficulty of the exam is a lot more streamlined. So in that case, I think that you know, you're probably in for a better shot when it comes to the exam because it is typically quite fair. And the last point that I would make is that you have tons of time leading up to that exam, and there's plenty of practice resources available there. So you can really put that time in to do well on the exam. But again, it's like, oh, with like a bit of balance. The next tip that I would say would be to do your practice exams correctly. Now, this like advice is definitely like take it or leave it, in my opinion. But some do's for your exam that I would probably recommend would be to mimic the conditions that you would do the exam in. I know that some like study tips have been like, do your exams in the same exam hall that you're going to sit it in, like your practice exams. And I completely understand that that is probably impossible because I'm sure like a lot of you might not be able to like go to school if you're under lockdown, but B, like it's probably just not super realistic for the most part. I think that, you know, unless you're doing a sort of like trial exam where that's like really designed to be like that, it might not be super realistic. You might be doing them more so like at night after school and all of that. But I would say like try to mimic a similar kind of situation. So you want to be minimizing noise and having a nice quiet space to do it in. The next do that I would suggest for doing and practicing those exams would be to complete the whole exam in one sitting. The reason why I recommend that is because, in my opinion, the economics exam is a little bit of a grind. There's definitely not a lot of time to write that exam in. And I was certainly someone in school and probably now that like struggles to write by hand under time pressure. Haven't had to write like essays and stuff by hand because uni stuff is all online, but you're going to have to write that economics exam by hand. And I found that to be really difficult. I just wrote really slowly. So completing the whole exam in one sitting was really important because it allowed me to prioritize the sorts of questions that I would like need a little bit of extra time to write on and practice writing in a structured way and an efficient and quick way. So you don't want to essentially be rambling because that is going to eat into the time that you have to answer other questions. The next tip would be to use the full time you have allotted to you. So for the economics exam, that is 2 hours, and you've also got 15 minutes of reading time. So I would recommend doing a couple of practice runs, including that reading time. I know like if you're sort of keen to burn through like a few exams or you're a bit short on time, you might not want to include that reading time. Totally fair enough. But I would absolutely recommend giving it a bit of a shot just to give you a bit of a strategy of what you're actually going to do in the exam. So I think quite a lot of the time, students, including myself, get into an exam and you're like, oh my God, exam. And then you're like, oh no, like I've got 15 minutes. What do I do with that time? So it's really good to have a bit of a practice to know how you're going to use that time wisely. And the last tip that I would have for completing exams would be to absolutely mark those exams. That's going to be really important to know where you went wrong and learn from your mistakes. Some don'ts that I have for exams, the first one is probably the most important. Do not do practice exams or any kind of like revision or study, I would say, if you're extremely tired or stressed. It's just not worth it. It's better to invest that time into taking a break, having a bit of a Netflix watch, and like having a nap or something like that, or going to bed early. So I would really strongly discourage, sort of pushing yourself too far to the point where you're just like really, really stressed and worried about the exam. Most things can kind of wait. And again, like you're probably not going to be doing this right the night before the exam, but I would also highly discourage that. It's better to space out your time a little bit so you're not sort of getting really stressed leading up to that exam. Another don't would be to have like really strong expectations of what mark you should be achieving on them. So if you're sort of like, I don't know, you've been achieving a certain SAC grade all year and you start to do some practice exams and you find that you're achieving a lower grade than you've been getting throughout the year, that's absolutely fine. Practice exams are literally there to practice. The worse you do in the practice exam, the better almost, because it shows that, you've got some areas of improvement, and it allows you to really easily see that and work on it actively throughout. And another don't would be to not do just the multiple choice or put minimal effort in. So definitely I would recommend at least doing a few practice exams that you sort of put that full effort in. If you want to have a bit of a practice of just multi-choice questions or have a go at planning out responses, that's like totally fair. That's like good practice as well. Just make sure that by the time you do that exam, you've had a bit of a go at doing some of the exams, because it's just going to hopefully make you feel better about being able to do the exam in 2 hours. When it comes to like listening to music while doing exams, I think that's like a bit debatable. I personally like listening to music to sort of like do my studying. I know for some people, like music with words in it distracts them, so they listen to like lo-fi or just other like study music. There's plenty of playlists on YouTube, on Spotify, wherever you get your music from. I personally find it fine to listen to music provided I know the songs. I can't listen to new music because my brain just like works too hard apparently to like work out what's going on. So I would recommend either getting a good study playlist, because that can be quite motivating in my opinion, but if you work better in silence as well, that's totally fine too. The next tip that I would have would be to plan your exams out. So I would say that breaking down your sort of like study to-do list into the smallest increments possible is really beneficial. And the way that I did that in like my sort of study period leading up to exams in high school was pretty much like this. I had a bit of a table that laid out all of the like days leading up to the exam. And I would say like, roughly every 2 to 4 days, I'll do one economics exam. I'll kind of alternate with like a chemistry paper and do a few English essays here and there. But I would recommend kind of spacing it out like this. I definitely think that the way I did my to-do list was maybe a bit optimistic at times. So there was definitely some days where I maybe didn't get everything done. But in my opinion, at least having a bit of a plan, even if you don't stick to it 100%, having that plan there is just so helpful because again, it's like that sort of trusting yourself that you're going to be able to work through and do some practice leading up to the exam. And by the time I hit, I don't know, the 11th of whatever month this was, I'm going to achieve X, Y, and Z by that point. And even if I haven't achieved it 100%, even if I've only got it 80%, that's way better than not having the plan in the first place because I haven't had anything to reference. So I definitely recommend breaking down your study into tasks. I know some people use study timetables, so they would say like between the hours of X and X on this day I'm going to do this subject. For me that was a bit too rigid. I preferred having a bit more of a flexible thing depending on what I had the energy for and what I felt like I needed to revise a little bit more, but that works too. And another thing that I heard people did, which I thought was quite smart, was actually pretending like your study day is a school day. So I know like from like my school, we started at like 8:50 in the morning, and then like period 1 went until like 50 minutes after that. So if you can, like, I suppose, pretend that you've got like a school week in those sort of like study or holiday periods or swap back, you might be able to like get in some really good periods of study just as if you were following like a school day. So that's a technique you could use as well. The next tip that I would suggest, which kind of leads on from the tips about practicing exams and also making sure that you've kind of planned out your revision, is to make sure you're kind of keeping track of the learning that you do throughout that period. So for me, I think like, and this speaks for like most people, I suppose, like I definitely remember things like if I've immediately marked something and gone like, oh, I made a mistake there, but probably like 2 days later or a week later, there's like no chance I'm going to remember that. So what I did was I like made a bit of a list of the common mistakes that I had made and sort of like why I missed out on certain marks on each exam. So say, for instance, this was like exam number 1. I got this grade on it. I maybe remembered a lot of the stuff from area of study 3 and I was like surprised. So I feel like I did well at that, but I was really lacking in some certain areas. I didn't know like the definition of the terms of trade, and I couldn't think of an example of like a budgetary policy for X, Y, and Z. Where I kind of lost the marks, I suppose, is probably where the biggest load of mistakes, the list I would have in here would be, and the actions that I would need to take. So for instance, research and more budgetary policy and brush up on the definitions for Australia and the world economy related topics. I find this to be like extremely helpful. This is like definitely something I still use in uni. I think it's like really good. It might seem a bit like self-deprecating. You're just kind of like writing down a list of all the things that you've gotten wrong. But in my opinion, for the most part, if I had written something down in here, I wouldn't typically make the same mistakes again. And it just kind of reinforced the ability to learn from the mistakes and reinforce the practice. And I think it's just, yeah, it's definitely been like a really helpful technique that I picked up from school. The next tip would be to look at the VCE Examination Reports. So basically, these are like the marking schemes, but they're a little bit different because they not only typically tell you the answers, but they typically say what examiners found that students did bad at in the exam. So there's a lot of content in here of basically the VCE examiners roasting what people have said in past, and especially where it's been really clear that lots of students haven't understood bits of content. So for the most part, when it comes to like students making mistakes, we know that in exams, teachers, examiners put in questions that help differentiate like students in different bands. And they're, of course, probably going to pick the areas that students do pretty bad in for those kind of differentiating questions. So what I'm saying is basically it's helpful to look at what students typically don't do so well at and make sure you're good at doing those things. And that will help you avoid any sort of like curveballs that might be put in that exam to make certain questions seem a little bit more difficult. At the end of the day, they can only assess you on what's in the study design, but it is helpful to see what students typically find more difficult and make sure you've brushed up on those bits of content. The next tip would be to practice writing under time pressure. So I kind of mentioned this before in terms of writing that exam and making sure you've had a shot at doing the exam within the 2 hours. But another way that you can kind of practice your writing without doing a full exam is having a go at a certain question that is worth like X amount of marks and giving yourself, say, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes to do that question based on what you would realistically allocate towards that question in the exam. So you're probably not going to want to spend like 5 to 10 minutes on a really small 2-mark question. You want to make sure that you're allocating a proportionate amount of time to the marks given. So I would really recommend practicing completing questions under time conditions. A lot of the time when it comes to economics, there's lots of stuff you can include in the questions itself because there's like quite a bit of content that you need to know about. But writing a big long essay about something that is kind of related but not really to the question is definitely not something that you want to be doing when you're under that time pressure. So for this reason, practicing is just so helpful. Like I cannot recommend it enough. It really helps you build up that good structure to your exam questions and really start hitting the nail on the head in terms of what those examiners are looking for when it comes to writing the exams. And the last resource that I have for you is or the last tip rather, is to use all your resources. So the great thing about the internet is that there's just tons of pretty much free stuff available, but there's also stuff that you would have at school. So YouTube I found to be extremely helpful. That being said, a lot of the YouTube resources are definitely kind of geared towards a more American economics course. So definitely keep that in mind. But that's not to say that they're not helpful. So they're really, really helpful for your basic economic concepts and just learning about extra pieces of context, I suppose. I really liked Crash Course. They've got videos for tons of different subjects, but I really liked their economics ones because they were really straight to the point and kind of like nice. Sometimes just like watching a video instead of really intensely studying, it's like almost a bit of like productive procrastination, but you're still like learning stuff, might be useful as well. Definitely use your teachers. And of course, like I'm sure this is like a lot more difficult in this sort of situation now when it comes to like COVID and how everything has like impacted schools and the way students are learning. But I would definitely recommend, if like it is possible, using your teachers, asking them for feedback on certain questions, getting them to mark things. That can be really helpful. A lot of the time when it comes to VCE, the good thing is that your teachers don't know what's on the exam. So they have like every incentive to help you practice and make sure you know all that content. So it's not like a situation where they've written a SAC and they don't want to give answers away. They're going to be like putting in all of that sort of like work and effort to help you do well on that exam. So definitely use them. They're a really fantastic resource. Textbooks as well. Of course, that's probably goes without saying, but it is helpful to maybe have a brush up on some of those pieces of content you missed and use things in the textbook like summaries and the questions that they have at the end. That can be quite helpful. And there's also like free online questions and websites with information. And of course, all of your Skyline resources as well, like this revision series video. So yeah, that's basically it for my sort of like top 10 tips for economics. Again, sort of take them or leave them depending on what works best for you. I might hand over to the next section, which is our Q&A with Nick. So I'm going to switch over to the mentee slides now. If you haven't had a chance to ask a question yet, please do ask a question and pop it onto the mentee. Yeah, I suppose I don't think we have any that's specifically related right now, but might be good, Nick, if you could give a bit of an overview of what your sort of journey into your role was like now and what your sort of like everyday role looks like at UBS.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose like many of the students here today, I was studying economics when I was in high school. I really enjoyed it. And I went on to study it at Sydney Uni for a bachelor's degree. So that was 3 years of full-time study. And within your degree of economics, you get to pick a major. And so at Sydney Uni, they had a fair few different majors. You could do things like econometrics, which is more statistics based. You could do financial economics. You could do agricultural economics. And you can do then plain economics, which is what I did, which is sort of focusing on both micro and macro, and more similar to, I suppose, what you get exposure to in a high school curriculum like the VCE. And during that period of study, there were multiple recruitment days where certain companies like maybe UBS or other financial institutions would come to uni and they'd talk to you about what they do and about career opportunities. And I effectively went to a couple of those, and they're called sort of networking events, and you go along and you maybe have a drink and meet some of the people in the firm. And then following on from that, you can apply for the internship programs. So that was sort of how I got into the financial industry and into the role as an economist. And I did a 10-week program at Commonwealth Bank, focusing on the Australian economy. And then after that internship, you basically may get an offer to work at the firm full time. And so I did get an offer and I took that. And worked there for a period of about a year and a half before joining UBS. And I suppose the process is relatively competitive, much like high school. And I mean, in terms of what I do day to day, I basically start off every morning. We have a call with the equities sales desk, and what they're trying to do is they've got clients who are trading stocks in the Australian Stock Exchange, and those clients could be highly sophisticated financial institutions like hedge funds, or they could be superannuation funds and other managed funds. They may have different strategies in place. Some of them might be long only, some of them might use short, some of them may use derivative products to increase their leverage and seek returns. And in that meeting, what their sales team really want to find from research is they want to know any sort of ideas that we have that may move the market and that can help their clients get an edge and potentially rotate from one part of the market to another. And I suppose one rotation I might just talk about very briefly is the goods to services shift. And as many of you would probably be aware, with lockdown and a lot of consumers stuck at home, what people have done is they've tended to invest heavily in their home, and including things like renovations. They've tended to invest in vehicles, and they've also tended to buy a lot of electrical goods, furniture, and other sort of home improvement type activities. And so that part of the economy has performed incredibly well. And you've seen, companies like Harvey Norman have seen massive revenues and profits. But now we think that there's going to be a shift back to services, particularly travel, and other services like eating and drinking out. And I was out on the weekend having a picnic, and I'm hoping many of you will be able to sort of enjoy that after your exams. And there were a lot of people who are out and about in Sydney, and I think people are very excited to get back and engage. So that's one sort of trend that we might talk about at that meeting, and then those sales will go take that idea and they might repackage it, and they might find a client that they think that idea is relevant to, and they can pitch that idea to them. And then we do the same meeting for the fixed income and currencies desk. And then we come back and we often prepare for data releases that are usually 11:30 from the Bureau of Statistics. And I'm sure many of you are learning those statistics now for your exams. And we cover all data in the Australian economy, from GDP to inflation to trade, pretty much you name it, household wealth. And then we'll usually prepare for that release, write the release, and then obviously we'll have client interactions, and clients may want to do deeper dives and sort of talk to us more. And I see a few questions here, so I suppose I might just stop there and have a go at answering them if you like. So what ATAR do you need to become an economist? And do you need to be really good at English? Well, I suppose I'll answer the second question first. You do need to talk to clients, and you do need to communicate, but you don't as such need to know complexities of grammar and metaphors and other sort of writing techniques. You just need to be able to speak clearly and precisely. And really the most important thing is that you can convey a message very, very briefly, because clients don't have much time and sometimes they just want to know the answer. What ATAR do you need? Well, to be honest, the ATAR requirement for economics isn't the most competitive. I think at Sydney Uni, which was sort of quite a competitive uni, was around 80 when I applied, and I imagine it would be around there roughly. I think they did increase the price of the HECSTET to study economics, because they don't think it's a role in the Australian economy that's particularly in demand. So while it's not necessarily as competitive to study it, being an economist is quite a specialized role. I mean, you've got a really specialist skill set. You're drilling down into a lot of data. And I suppose there's not, because what we do is so high level, we're looking at everything across the economy. You don't necessarily need, an economist in every organization. Sometimes in big banks and big institutions, you might have an economist. And at UBS here, we've got 2 Australian economists, so the chief economist and myself, and we've also got an economist in New Zealand. But I mean, compared to the size of UBS as a global bank, it's quite a lean makeup. And when I worked at Commonwealth Bank, the biggest bank in Australia, we had 4 economists in the team. I was the most junior, and we had a chief economist. So in the biggest bank of Australia, there's only about 5 economists. Now that is in the private sector. However, if you wanted to work in the public sector, there are a lot more economists. And that's because a lot of policy decision making is founded in economic logic and economic thought. And so the Reserve Bank have literally an army of economists analyzing the data right down to, say, a specific regional level. They might look at data in Byron Bay and say, what is our policy having impacts on house prices in different areas? And then you've got Treasury and you've got all the other executive branches of the government, which need economists. So depending on where you want to work, there's a lot more economist jobs in the public sector, but there are some in the private sector, and those jobs are typically a bit more financially focused.
Awesome. We've got some other questions as well. So this one.
How do I find internships? Great question. Look, my internship was actually really fun. It's sort of a good period where you don't get given much responsibility in your job. You sort of are just there to learn. And it's as much about, people looking at you and saying, oh, you're good at your job. It's not really, that's part of it. They do want to make sure, your boss wants to make sure you're going to work and you're going to do what they ask. But really, it's also just about, hey, here's a couple things you can learn. You're not going to learn how to be a sell-side market economist in 10 weeks, but maybe you can write a report. So I wrote a report on aged care, and they also take you out to client meetings. So I went to go watch my boss at the time, who went and spoke on Fox News. And then they also took me out to client lunches, and sometimes you get to do Christmas parties because it's often over the summer period. So you get to you sort of get taken out for drinks, and you do have a lot of fun, and it's sort of a really good part of my career that I always look back and be really fond of, because I did learn a lot, but I also didn't really have the stress and the responsibility that you have when you are sort of, I suppose, after being a graduate and you're working full time. You sort of have a fair bit more responsibility.
Yeah, awesome. And the next one here, probably on a little bit similar, but if you want to chat to it briefly.
Oh, sure. I'll just quickly say, I didn't actually do a lot of work experience for economics. I suppose in the interview, what they wanted to know was, sort of standard behavioral questions like, have you had leadership or co-curricular experience? And I'm sure many of you here today already do. And they also want to know, can you think? So I got asked theoretical questions, which many of you would be able to answer now, and which you will then go learn more about if you study economics. Things like, why have we seen house prices increase so much over the last 2 decades, but inflation has been so weak? And so a question like that, where they're trying to get to see where your understanding is in terms of economics. If you can answer that question, you may not need to have experience in economics. Very hard to have experience outside of uni unless you work as an economist. So I don't think that would be a requirement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like the year 12 curriculum is super relevant to that. I think like for me, my experience with like economics in uni, it's a lot more like theoretical, but I think that the economics course in year 12 is actually like quite practical, and it is quite grounded in like what's actually going on, which I think is a really good intro to have, especially when sort of other content gets a little bit more like theoretical. Got this question as well. I guess you kind of briefly mentioned this, but if there was anything else that you had to add.
I suppose there's always, so being an economist, if you are particularly good at the role and there's a lot of uncertainty in financial markets, and you can offer an insight that other people haven't yet cottoned onto, your view will be in high demand. And so I suppose it's almost like anything. If you're a good sports player and you can do something that other players can't, people always want to hire the next Ronaldo, the next Messi. And so there will always be demand, but there is, I suppose there's only so many economists that the market in the private sector can absorb. And I think it's pretty saturated. And so I suppose at the very top end, for the top economists, there is still demand, but there's not necessarily broad-based demand. So I think it's still a great thing to study, but to be a specialist economist in the private sector as a market economist, there is, I suppose, it's not a growth sector in the economy like other areas, like health, STEM, engineering and education. But for top people in their field, you can always get a role.
Yeah. And I think like in terms of like economics, there's definitely like demand for economists themselves, but I think the field of economics is just quite broad too. Like there's plenty of economic theory that kind of comes into lots of different sectors and lots of different jobs. And I think, and I don't know about you, Nick, if like you kind of agree, but like the ability to sort of, this sounds like a bit cliche, but like think like an economist and have that sort of like mindset and view of the world. I think that's like so valuable and so useful in like tons of different careers.
I would definitely just quickly add, if you're thinking about going into finance or banking, I think economics is a really good thing to study. And the reason I think that is because economics is a way of thinking, and finance or commerce is still very relevant, but it's more the instruments, the tools, and the language of finance. And you will learn some modeling in it, but economics will teach you the underlying drivers of economic activity, and then ultimately of those financial instruments which the financial industry centers around. So I think it's really good, and it's hard to learn a way of thinking when you're in a job. You can learn how to code, you can learn how to learn a new language, but it's really hard to learn how to think like an economist when you're already in a job. It's much better to learn that when you're in high school and when you're at university, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's like that what would take the longest time. So the earlier, the better, I would say. And the next one, what is a typical day like as an economist?
Yeah, I suppose with just data, some days, so yeah, we have our meetings, and then we have the data that comes out, and we publish notes. So we usually publish anywhere from 3 to sort of 4 notes a week. And then there'll be talking to clients about our views. And then often we'll also do collaboration with other teams. So maybe that would be looking at fixed income. So looking at the debt that the Australian government has printed in public markets and saying, is that debt fairly valued? Is the stock of government debt going to increase? And looking at sort of longer term trends like taxation, demographics, population growth, and then how that feeds into those financial instruments. So there's a lot of collaboration being an economist, and there's certainly a lot of data. And even more recently, if you think about one recent activity has been Evergrande in China, looking at potentially defaulting on hundreds of billions of dollars of loans, and many of those are actually owed to the US. And so, you know, we're looking at, well, is this a credit contagion? Could this spread across the financial system, potentially through China and then globally? And what could the impact be? So I think there's a good quote for markets generally, not just for an economist, but the only thing that's constant is change. And markets are always changing, and we're trying to grapple with that and get ahead of it. And I suppose our day just fits itself around that.
Yeah, awesome. I don't think there's any other questions for the time being. But one thing that I sort of like wanted to get your perspective on, and I think would be good for the students, would be, I guess, like, what was the sort of main differences that you saw going from studying economics in high school to studying at uni? And I guess what would be like a piece of advice you would have for the students today?
Okay. I just saw a really great question came through, but I will answer your one first. So
True.
The difference between high school and university is that university is, I suppose, it's much quicker to teach you. They'll literally give you one lesson, and you will do an entire multi-factor model of the economy, including all the flows. And then, well, maybe you'll build on it over a few more weeks, but it might be 4 weeks or if they're an hour and a half lecture, or 4 to 6 hours of lectures, and they'll expect you to know a lot of content. And that includes mathematical equations. So, you know, in lectures, they'll kind of just teach you a broad brush stroke of a concept. And then in tutorials, you'll get maybe an hour or two to drill into a few questions. But it's a lot faster. But the plus side to that is it's more varied. So because you can learn more in a semester, you actually get to learn so much more. So I learned everything from covering East Asian economies to looking at law and economics and how the legal system is interacting with our economy to create incentives to stop people doing things like speeding, and rational expectation hypotheses. And then I did things like business cycles and asset classes. So looking at the intersection of economics with the financial markets and things like house prices, equity markets. And so you get to pick a massive range. There's about 50 electives, I think, that were on offer, and you can go drill into whatever major or minor you want to do. And that is something that I found really exciting, and you do not get that opportunity in high school. I suppose I'll just quickly answer this question. I think this is a really good question. So well done, whoever's following the monthly labour force data. So the unemployment rate isn't a good indicator, especially at the moment. And the reason for this is because it's heavily influenced by the participation rate, or the amount of people who are looking for a job out of the eligible labour force. And what tends to happen during a shock when we have the economy effectively locked down by the government is that people stop looking for work. And often more people stop looking for work than the number of people who are let go. And so what this results in is the unemployment rate actually falling, when realistically, we know the level of underutilization in the economy is rising. Another indicator that you can use is called the underutilization rate. So that incorporates the unemployment rate and the underemployment rate. And what we saw in August was that rate actually moved up by about 1 percentage point. So that was material, and it was totally different to what happened to the unemployment rate. So you can use broader measures of slack in the labor market, and you can also use measures like hours worked, which is it has a direct relationship to the amount of work being done in the economy, and usually it's highly correlated with gross domestic product and economic activity. So hours worked, as well as underemployment and the underutilization rate. And then you've also got, if you wanted to, you could use participation and look at how many people are looking for work as a measure of whether or not lockdowns are having a large impact. And just one final indicator would be employment. So even though the unemployment rate fell, employment actually contracted by about 146,000 jobs in August. And that was a very large contraction. It's a lot of people who no longer have a job. So there's a couple of other metrics there in the labour force data, if you open up the release on the Bureau of Statistics website, that paint a much more deteriorating picture.
Yeah, fantastic. That's some really good stuff for them to look at as well. I think maybe taking a bit of a deeper dive into some of the stats that we look at is really, really important. So that's really fantastic. I think the last question is a bit more sort of like SAC related, but yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for hopping on today. Really, really fantastic advice for the students about, I guess studying economics and what it's like working as an actual economist rather. Thank you so much, Nick, for hopping on the webinar today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add to all the students out there, when I did high school, I never had to study from home, and I really take my hat off to all of you for how hard you've all been working. And I know that you'll get what you deserve, and you'll get the good marks that you've been working for when you get out the other end. And I wish you all the best in your fantastic careers.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
See you. All right. Awesome. We'll hop back into the slides now. So we're going to be let me just see how we're going for time. Just going through a brief run through of the study design now. I'm just going to screen share what I've got in front of me. So I'm just going to be annotating the study design essentially and going through some key points. But definitely keep the questions coming. Thank you guys for your questions. Really, some really fantastic ones in there. So definitely continue asking, especially if there's some stuff that I say that's confusing or you'd like me to elaborate further. I'm absolutely happy to do that. But basically, I suppose in the session today, I don't want to be going through every single point of content, because that's number one, quite hard to do in 3 hours. But number two, it's stuff you've seen before. So I guess what I really want to do here is help highlight some of the key things that you should be on the lookout for when it comes to your exam revision, any practice questions that you're doing. So I guess like this here is a study design. If you haven't seen it before, please do make sure you go and download it and use it as a guide for your revision. But yeah, I guess like when it comes to your exam, you're going to be tested on units 3 and 4. So these points here. And the first outcome or the first key piece of content that we look at is really based around microeconomics. So we look at outcome 1, relating to the sort of like basics of markets. We look at supply and demand. So lots of the like curriculum and the stuff that you learn about basically revolves around what is a market, how is a market made, how do markets allocate resources, what goes wrong, when do markets experience market failures and why, and finally, how the government addresses those market failures. So the first few things that we look at are some really basic economic concepts that you could probably answer without any knowledge in economics. So you need to know about relative scarcity. So this idea that we've got a shortfall of resources effectively, which kind of necessitates making decisions about where to allocate those resources. And that decision making is the study of economics. So economics is how we allocate resources in the economy. So we look at needs, so stuff we need, wants, stuff we want, resources, so the resources we have in the economy, so the sort of land, labor, and capital resources, and opportunity cost. So this is this really key concept in economics, which is the idea of the cost of what you forgo when you make a decision. Then we look at the conditions of a perfectly competitive market. Quite a lot of the time, you might get asked a question that basically asks you to run through 2 main features of a competitive market. So make sure you brush up on those features, things like having many buyers and sellers, having perfect market knowledge, homogeneous goods, etc. Having all of those pieces of content are really important. The next study design dot point, which is really key, is like the law of demand and supply in general. So you basically need to be really clear on answering a good demand and supply question, which hopefully is a little bit easier considering you've studied it a bit at the start of the year. But you really want to be able to answer a supply and demand question well, and I'm going to go over that in our next section. But you basically want to be able to differentiate between movements and shifts in the demand and supply curve, and also the factors that affect demand. So things like disposable income, prices of substitutes and complements, changes in preferences, changes in tastes, and these can be heavily influenced by things like advertising, for instance, interest rates. So basically interest rates being what people are charged on borrowed funds. So if people are charged more on their borrowed funds, they're going to have less income remaining to purchase goods and services. So they're going to demand less at each and every price. And changes in population. Of course, if you've got more people, they're going to demand more stuff and vice versa. And if people are feeling more confident, they're going to be more willing and able to spend their money and therefore demand something. And then we look at the exact same kind of things of supply, except I suppose we look at these from a more producer side. So we're going to be looking at things like changes in the cost of production. So this affecting how producers produce stuff, how much they produce, changes in technology, changes in productivity and climate conditions. And basically, we don't really care so much about supply and demand by themselves. What we really care about is actually having a look at how they work together to influence the price and quantity traded in the economy. The next piece of the study design, which is really important, is this idea of relative prices. So this is a really key and commonly overlooked piece of content, which is basically how we allocate resources in an economy. So the way that it works is effectively we look at relative prices. So if we look at 2 different goods, for instance, like pens and pencils, if people demand more pens, that's going to put upward pressure on the price of pens. So pens are going to have a relatively higher price, and that acts as a price signal to producers, basically saying these pens are more profitable. You can make more money by producing them. So therefore, firms are going to allocate their resources to producing these things that are demanded more and therefore have higher relative prices. So this is the idea of how markets should allocate resources And that should be like really efficient, right? So this idea that if firms are putting their resources towards what people want, then that sounds great. That sounds like ideally like resources are going to be allocated to where they're demanded. The next kind of like bits of content that we look at kind of revolve around where that doesn't necessarily occur, which is when we have instances of market failure. Before we jump into market failure, there is a mention of elasticity of supply and demand. So make sure you're really across elasticity and what affects elasticity, and really having the idea in your mind that elasticity refers to the responsiveness of quantity demanded and supplied to changes in prices. So that idea of responsiveness is really, really important. The next dot point is referring to the idea of efficiency. So you need to have definitions for the 4 different types of efficiency that are mentioned. So allocative efficiency, relating to how resources are allocated in their most efficient way. Productive efficiency, where we have resources basically being allocated in such a way that we're maximizing the output from the minimum input. Dynamic efficiency, which is when we can move around and shift around methods of production to respond to changes in preferences, and also like other things as well. And the idea of like competitive markets, I suppose, at the end, and our key market failures that we look at, including public goods, externalities, asymmetric info, and common access resources. So it's really important that you're super across those key market failures, and also what the government can do to, number 1, address them. So like government intervention, but number 2, when government intervention goes wrong and we've got some unintentional consequences or some government failure. So within your SAC, you would have had to have an example of government failure. So for instance, you could use various different examples over time. I believe the carbon tax is one example, setting like of minimum wages and penalty rates and all of that is another thing that you could potentially talk about. You kind of just want to go with whatever example that you can like talk about easily there. So that's the microeconomics dot point. In my opinion, this is probably the second trickiest outcome when it comes to the exam. And the reason why that is because they can ask lots of different questions. But the best practice that you can do is see as many different questions as possible so that you're able to really like easily and effectively answer a wide variety of different questions. The next outcome is looking at macroeconomic goals, which is really relating to the key goals that we look at, which are the goal of low inflation, the goal of strong and sustainable growth, and the goal of full employment, if I can find that. There we go. So some of the stuff that Nick just talked about in terms of like the labor force classifications, he mentioned things like the participation rate, the unemployment rate, and the underutilization rate. You really need to be across all of these measures of unemployment, and that's a really common things that students find quite difficult. So there's some equations that you need to remember. Make sure you're across those equations because they help you not only answer questions about content, but also kind of like Nick was talking about relating it to what's going on in the actual economy. So you need to have that background knowledge, but also be able to sort of write about it when it comes to talking about more content and theory related questions. So we basically go in depth about all of those goals in this unit here. And we also look at aggregate demand and aggregate supply and this idea of circular flow and the business cycle. So make sure you're kind of across those measures of economic activity as well. The next area of study is, in my opinion, the hardest. This is the Australia and the world economy section. This is when we have a bunch of different more complicated measures of the economy, I would say. And the reason why they're so complicated is because there's so many causes and effects. So this thing affects this thing, which affects this thing, which affects this. It's a lot of that sort of explanation, which in my opinion is why this particular unit is so tricky. And again, I probably sound like a broken record at this point, but the more practice you can get at making these links and drawing those cause and effect relationships, the better when it comes to this unit. So we need to know about trade in general. We need to know about the balance of payments and its components. This is really key. And we're going to look at things like the sort of current account deficit, net foreign debt, the terms of trade, the exchange rate, and various other things that kind of affect Australia's like international competitiveness, goals, and living standards in a more broad sense. So make sure you can both define all of these components here and also explain all of the relationships that are shown in the study design. So for instance, the effect of the exchange rate movements on the current account, the goals, and living standards. Make sure you can say how the exchange rate affects all of those different things. And the next units are all in Unit 4. So Unit 4, Area of Study 1 is primarily about AD policies, and Unit 4, Area of Study 2 is about AS policies. So when it comes to aggregate demand questions and aggregate demand pieces of content, we're really focusing on monetary and budgetary policy. So you really need to be across all of those, and you also need to have some up-to-date, nice examples of budgetary and monetary policy. So with budgetary policy, make sure you've read up on some government budget policy initiatives. I know it's not always the funnest thing to do, and I'm going to talk about this at the end a little bit. It was certainly something that I didn't enjoy researching because I didn't feel like I knew enough, and I really don't like researching things when I don't feel like I'm super knowledgeable about the subject. But the best thing that you can do is just really make sure you've got some solid examples that you know how to refer to and talk about, because that's going to set you up in the best possible situation. When it comes to the budgetary policy unit, don't overlook the key things that you might need to define. So make sure you've got a definition for all of the key points here, things like direct and indirect taxation, revenue from different sources, government expenses, how the government finances deficits and utilizes surpluses. This is probably one of the most overlooked dot points, and students, like, this is extremely hard to answer without knowing the actual answer to it. So just be a little bit careful on that one. Make sure you're really across that. And we also look at automatic and discretionary stabilizers, budgetary policy stance, the effect of those initiatives from the past 2 years. So this is the dot point where you have to have your own examples, and also strengths and weaknesses. Monetary policy, we look at, how monetary policy works, interest rates, the role of open market operations, transmission mechanisms is a really key way of linking interest rates to AD, and how monetary policy has affected the economy. The last unit of study is relatively shorter. So this is all about AS policies. In this case, we're basically looking at how the budget can have elements that relate to AS. So we specifically look at 4 different examples of budgetary policy, but also how welfare, tax, and immigration affect AS, and the strengths and weaknesses of policies that are designed to target aggregate supply. So I guess this has been the most speedy run through of the study design. So definitely take a little bit of time and have a look through it. But what I would recommend doing, and the way that I used to go through the study design in high school, was highlighting things in green if I knew them quite well, orange if I wasn't too sure, and red for the points where I wasn't super sure about. For instance, maybe this one here, I'm I have no idea, I do not remember that at all. And then you can go ahead and help that sort of guide your revision a little bit. Awesome. So we're going to jump into a bit of a break now. So let me share my PowerPoint again. So it's been plenty of stuff. We'll be having a bit of a 10-minute break. I believe before we go into the break, we're going to play a quick video, which is from one of our UBS volunteers.
Hi, I'm Serena, and I work in the Operations Division at UBS. Operations is all about the inner workings of the business and making sure UBS runs as efficiently and smoothly as possible. And one of my biggest career highlights today is actually something quite small. Basically on the job, we have to answer the phone sometimes. And in the beginning, I was very anxious about answering the phone if I would say something wrong. All of that. But when I started to get used to it, and with the help of my colleagues, I was able to kind of overcome that fear of picking up the phone and talking to potential clients or counterparties. And I think that was quite a big step for me, because, talking to external clients outside of the business is an important facet of every single job that you're going to be a part of. I graduated high school in 2020 and I did the HSC, which is the New South Wales equivalent of the VCE. And the subjects that I took were Maths Advanced, English Advanced, Modern History, Economics, and Chemistry. My favourite subjects were Modern History and Economics, just because of the kind of reality aspect they both have, as they both kind of relate to the life that I live now, looking at, the current affairs that are happening now, market trends, how the economy is reacting. And that also led me to pursue a Bachelor of Commerce at uni, and I'm doing a major in finance and economics, which I'm really enjoying right now. If I were to give advice to my future self, I would say don't be too hung up on or discouraged by anything that doesn't go the way that you planned or envisioned, because I believe everything happens for some sort of reason, and there is lots to learn in every failure and every success as well. Knowing what I know now, if I was advising myself a few weeks before sitting my year 12 exams, I would say don't feel guilty about not studying 24/7 if everyone around you looks like they are. It is definitely extremely important to not burn out during the weeks upcoming to your exams, because you feel like you have not done your best. So I think take the breaks when you can. Just go for a walk outside, clear your mind. It's not a waste of time, because in the future, if you are burnt out, then you're going to be going for a few days without studying because you just don't feel like it. So make sure you just take those breaks and don't feel guilty about it.
Awesome. Absolutely second that. And on the spirit of taking breaks, we're going to move into a 5-minute break. No, 10-minute break, I lied. So I guess a 10-minute break will take us to 3 o'clock. So I guess I'll see you guys all back in 10 minutes. So definitely get up, have a walk around, have a drink. It's definitely what I'm going to do. I'm going to go make myself some more tea. So we'll see you back in 10 minutes. Thanks, everyone. All right, so that's it for the break. So welcome back, everyone. Before we jump into the more music. Before we jump into the next section of today's lecture, I'll play a quick video, and we might spend just a couple of minutes answering some questions as well, just so we don't have a bunch at the end.
Something happens when we feel really stressed, like borderline anxious. Something happens in our brain that, unless you know how to deal with it, it's actually one of the places where our brains actually totally hold us back. Like they make things stacks worse than they actually need to be. So in this video, I'm going to share what actually happens in our brain so that you get what's going on, but then also share something you can do, like a little hack you can do that's super simple that you always have. Like once you hear it, you'll always have it. You can always use it. That helps you override some of the default stuff that our brain does that literally, gosh, our brains are amazing, like totally extraordinary. Like, it's hard to believe that in some ways it completely holds us back and has us feel horrible and completely overreact during things like, taking an exam or asking someone out or public speaking or being in an interview. You know how stressed out you can feel about that? And logically you go, that makes no sense. I'm not stressed. Like, what's the worst that can happen? But in your body, you're completely freaking out. So when that stuff starts to happen to our bodies, when we're worried about something, it sends a signal to our brain that it needs to protect us. And the problem with this is that the signal it sends is that it needs to physically protect us, like we're in some kind of physical danger. So what it does is it sends a shot of stress hormones like adrenaline to our body that has us get into the mode of being able to either run away or stay and fight. So fight or flight, it gives us fight or flight chemicals because it thinks we're in physical danger. And normally we're not. We're like either really worried that she's going to say no, or we're like worried that we're going to fail an exam, or we're not going to do well in an interview. But we get these stress chemicals that have us like seriously, like we're pumped up to fight or to run away. And that's the last thing you want to experience in your body when you're just about to do something that has you need to be in your head. Because you actually can't be in your head when you've got those chemicals running through you. They actually shut down your brain. Like your mind wants you to be 100% focused on your body and using it to either run away or stay and fight. So it doesn't want to spend any energy in your brain thinking through things. Like that's the last place it wants you to spend energy. So you literally, like you can fully go blank or just forget stuff and go, what happened to me there? So here's what you do. You simply have to say something to communicate to your brain why you're feeling stressed. It sounds corny, but you have to say, you're okay, Leah, you're gonna be fine. You're just stressed because this is really important to you. You are safe.
Awesome. So nice little tip there. And very true. I feel like a lot of exam stuff we like pump up to be like really, really important and stressful. But at the end of the day, a lot of the time, the best thing that you can do is find a way to sort of like calm your nerves, I guess, and know that it's really definitely not the end of the world. That exam, it's not the most important thing ever. And like you'll be able to do it, I guess. So I suppose with that, we're going to be moving on to a bit of a practice section of today's session. But before we jump into that, I just wanted to do a bit of a mentee quiz. So it's kind of like mini practice multi-choice questions. So we're going to jump into that. So if you haven't logged into the mentee yet, please do. I'll switch over and share the slides for the little quiz that we've got going. Cool. So the first question here, if you are able to log in, I might just wait a little bit so that you can all pop your like nicknames in and get ready to go for the quiz. I think I see some people joining. So I'll give you guys a little bit of time. We've just got 5 quick multi-choice questions to get you warmed up and thinking about some economics questions as we jump into the practice section of today's session. So we've still got some people joining. Wait till that kind of slows down. But there's definitely some technique when it comes to multi-choice stuff. So we've got some questions now. Jump into it. I'm not sure. There's some people joining and leaving. I think we'll get started. So it's a bit like a Kahoot. You want to answer as quickly as possible, and it will help you get the most points. Awesome. So well done. And exports are classified as a credit on the net goods account. So make sure you've read up on all the different accounts and especially what counts as a credit and what counts as a debit. The basic idea is that a credit is any money coming into Australia and a debit is anything coming out of Australia. So for net goods or for exports, we send some goods overseas, but we get money in return. So the money's coming to Australia, so it's going to count as a credit. We'll jump into the next question. And well done to who have we got in the lead? Looks like Nemo in the lead. And this one, a higher interest rate would result in higher levels of consumption, higher value of the Australian dollar, lower capital inflow, or all of the above. So bit of a mix, but majority still got this one right. This is a hard question, mind you, so sorry about that. But yes, so the interest rate, if it is higher in Australia, it incentivizes people from overseas to come invest in Australia because they're able to get a higher return, and that pushes up the demand for and therefore value for our currency. So I think I might have stuffed up how I've organized this quiz. I think this is like question 2 of 2, but I do have 3 more questions. So it might reset everything. So I guess we'll have some winners of the first quiz, which is Frosty. And then we'll have the second quiz as well. Actually, I don't think my questions got updated, but that's okay. We'll just jump into the slides for this. But some good questions that we've got coming through. Definitely get on to answering those. So when it comes to practicing stuff, there's some important things that you might want to kind of make sure you're aware of before you jump into practicing your exams. The first is being able to use the keywords that you get in exams to your advantage. The next is having the ability and the experience with structuring your answers and writing a really awesome answer. That's basically what half of the economics exam is about. It's a lot about making sure that you're able to like work your way through and understand the best way of going about a question. And the next and the probably like most important thing would be to just practice some like classic questions that you would get like all the time. And I'll be going through a bunch of those. We probably won't have enough time to cover all of them, but I wanted to put them all up there for you guys just so you've got access to them and you can reference them later. The first really key thing is to make sure that you're really across the command words used in economics. So making sure that you're able to differentiate between questions that only ask you for a bit of information and ones that ask you for quite a lot of information. So you'll sort of like identify, define, outline style questions are typically quite basic. They might just be asking for a definition or a basic overview of a concept. If you've got to distinguish or like differentiate, I feel like they wouldn't use that word, but those sorts of questions, you want to be drawing on 2 pieces of content and making some kind of comparison and using some kind of comparative word. So if you've got like a distinguished question, you want to make sure you're using like a however, this is this instead. So you want to be using words like while and however to make sure you are making sure you're differentiating between those 2 definitions rather than just plopping 2 definitions on the page. The next sort of questions, explain and describe, kind of take on a bit more like detail, I suppose, and you want to make sure you structure these quite nicely. And the final sort of style of question is your sort of evaluate and discuss and analyze style question, which asks you to more so draw upon some of the strengths and weaknesses of particular parts of the study design and particular pieces of content. So when it comes to structuring responses, the best thing that you can do is kind of guess the marking scheme. So you want to basically use the question that is being asked and use the mark allocation to guess where marks are being allocated in this case. And you also want to plan out your answers before you write, especially for bigger questions. So what I would do in this situation is typically write like a grey lead, jot down a couple of points of things that I wanted to say, mostly so I wouldn't forget, but it also helped me structure the answer because I knew exactly what I wanted to talk about in my however many lines I had to answer that question. There's some methods of structuring your responses. I know that in some other subjects, like structures to questions are quite specific. I know for like history, for instance, I didn't take it, but I know my friends did, and they said that you would always answer like a 6-mark or a 10-mark question in a particular way. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on like how you like to work, economics isn't prescriptive like that. There's definitely no set method of writing a response, but one really good strategy that I think can broadly be used in lots of questions is this DEE structure, which is to define, explain, and give an example. So a lot of the time, if you've got a question that's worth 3 to 4 marks, you want to be using this to start off giving a definition of the key concept the question is revolving around, and then answering your question and explaining it with an example typically. So for instance, I suppose like one question that you might have here would be to like answer a question on what is a market failure. So you would start off with the definition of a market failure being like the inability of a market to allocate resources efficiently. And then you might explain it by saying this occurs as a result of like over or underproduction of a particular good or service. For instance, if we look at like a vaccine and a positive externality, you might say like, for instance, vaccines have other additional benefits that impact other people within the economy, which aren't taken into account by people involved in making that decision. Therefore, they are going to be underproduced by the market, resulting in market failure, kind of along those sorts of lines. And you want to break down big questions. A lot of the time, you might have like a really big, scary, like 8-mark question that asks you about AD policies. Easiest way is to split it in half, spend half of the response talking about like budgetary policy and half talking about monetary policy. And there's lots of ways that you can kind of chop up those 8-mark questions to look a little bit smaller and more palatable, I suppose. And also make sure your answers are a suitable length. I don't have anything against writing over the lines. I certainly did that in some of my exams, but just don't write like a whole essay if it's only worth 2 marks. At the end of the day, you're going to have to write it. So you probably don't want to have to write a ridiculous amount in the time given in the exam. All right, so the next few slides are basically some classic questions that are really commonly asked in the exam. Sometimes the exams are a little bit uncreative, which is effectively why we have these questions here, but you're probably likely to see these in lots of different practice exams that pop up. So the first question is your classic supply and demand style question. So this here is a specific question that was asking students about unseasonably cold weather and the output of strawberries being negatively affected. And then it asked students to draw a graph and explain the adjustment in equilibrium price and quantity. This is a question that should be like super easy to answer once you've done a bit of study. You should definitely have a bit of a script in terms of like what you would want to go with. And I think the really fantastic example that we have is in the answers here. So basically, this is like a possible response that was given by VCAR. But basically, they started off by number 1 saying how the supply curve shifted. So they basically said that the unfavorable supply side condition, being the cold weather, led to a decrease in supply of strawberries at each and every price level. And at the equilibrium price, therefore, a shortage occurs. So this basically happens because we've got our supply and demand for strawberries. And sorry, that's a really terrible drawing. But we shift the supply back. And at the original price, there is a higher level of demand relative to supply. So this is our original like Q1 and original price. We see that there's a shortage because demand exceeds supply. So what's going to happen? Because there's a shortage, it places upward pressure on the price, because if you've got a shortage in a market, what does that mean? If you're a supplier, you're going to be like, I can like raise the price and make money because people are really demanding this thing. So that is going to result in prices actually increasing, and you're going to end up with a higher equilibrium price and also a lower equilibrium quantity, which is exactly what sort of goes down in this answer here. So being able to answer this is really key. The key points that you want to include are the direction of the shift in the supply and demand curve. Therefore, whether there is a shortage or a surplus of the good, shortage being when demand exceeds supply and a surplus being when supply exceeds demand. Then you want to say whether that shortage puts an upward pressure on price, or if there's a surplus that puts a downward pressure on price. Then you want to basically say what the new equilibrium quantity quantity and price are. When it comes to supply and demand, one thing to note is that if you've got something that affects demand, it'll push price and quantity in the same direction. So price and quantity will either increase or both decrease if demand changes. But for supply, as we can see here, the price went up, but the quantity went down. So price and quantity move in the opposite direction when we have changes in supply. So that might be helpful to do a bit of a sense check for your answers. The next key thing that you need to be able to answer is defining market failures, knowing which ones they are, knowing how the government deals with them, and knowing when the government kind of didn't do a good job at dealing with them, which I mentioned when we had a look at the dot points. But this question here is asking how either externalities or asymmetric information results in a market failure. So this is an example of what I would say would be good to use that define, explain, example framework. I would want to be explaining or defining like either asymmetric information or externalities and providing an example, and then linking that to how it is a market failure or how it results in a market failure. And to do that, you kind of need to be aware of what a market failure is. So a good example here for the negative externality one would be like starting here, I guess. And negative externalities affect third parties. Therefore, they don't take into account the externalities that arise from their actions, and you might have inefficiency. So an example of a negative externality is emissions from a coal-fired power station, and therefore climate change. The costs of this negative externality, which are like climate change, are not taken into account or internalized by producers. Therefore, we have an over allocation of resources towards the use in coal. And therefore, that's going to mean that that's not an efficient allocation of resources, and it's therefore a market failure. And you've also got this example with asymmetric information. As you can see, they've defined what asymmetric information is here. So when one party possesses more knowledge than the other, then they've given an example for the used car market, which is a really classic example about asymmetric information. The idea that a seller knows more about the quality of the car than the buyer, and therefore if the buyer purchases that car, they might have to pay for that car to be repaired, or they might have to pay the cost of having an unreliable car and have to get it towed or something like that. In any case, that seller hasn't been upfront about these sort of issues associated with that car, and therefore the buyer is ultimately paying a higher price for the used car than they would have if they had known what the fault was, which therefore leads to an over allocation of resources to the used car market, and that is therefore a market failure because we're over allocating. So I suppose the key word there that they're using to show a market failure is either the over or under allocation of resources towards a specific market. As you can see, there are some things that the VCAR examiners highlighted, so that basically students used quite simplistic and general language. For instance, it's better to say costs that occur and are sort of paid for by third parties rather than sort of bad outcomes for other people. That's quite a vague term. And you want to sort of like use language like cost to third parties, allocation of resources that doesn't maximize welfare or living standards, or over production or over consumption. Those are really good words to use. So that was why some students didn't get full marks for this question here. Cool. The next style of question might be your more aggregate demand style questions. So this is typically relating to the levels of demand and supply in the economy as a whole. And typically when it comes to AD, we want to have some kind of explanation of changes in AD impacting either growth, inflation, or unemployment. So if we're talking about changes to growth, you basically want to talk about how the specific thing that affects AD affects the AD equation. So we've got in our textbook and in our notes that aggregate demand is given by the level of consumption expenditure plus the level of investment expenditure done by the private sector, plus the public expenditure or government expenditure, plus net exports, or plus X minus M. Apologies for the kind of bad drawing on the PowerPoint slide. But basically, when it comes to AD questions, the most important thing is to highlight which particular part of AD your question is addressing. For instance, you might get a question like, how does lower levels of personal income tax affect growth? So if we're looking at personal income tax, that's going to affect private consumption expenditure. So if people get taxed less on their income, they're going to have more income to spend on stuff. So they're going to spend more on stuff, and that's going to increase consumption. That therefore increases AD. And now if we want to link it to growth, we want to say something like a high level of AD is going to result in higher levels of general demand in the economy, which causes producers to increase their output and therefore causes economic growth to increase. So that's the link to growth. If we want to relate it to unemployment, we would basically just add on to that growth explanation. We say the growth thing, and then we say, okay, in order to produce more stuff, firms need to hire more resources, including labor, to produce their stuff. So that is going to increase what we call The derived demand for labor, you might have used that, you might not have. It just basically means the demand for labor that firms have because they're producing stuff. And if the demand for labor or the derived demand for labor increases, that's going to put downward pressure on the unemployment rate. And the final link that we need to make is to inflation. When it comes to inflation, we can just go with the AD equation. So we basically say higher levels of aggregate demand are going to put upward pressure on the level of demand inflation in the economy. So that's the link that we use there. So these might be some of the questions that you would get relating to like some kind of AD factor, for instance, disposable income to some goal, for instance, growth. So we might look at like business confidence on inflation and government expenditure on the goal of full employment. The next topic, which I mentioned is probably the hardest one, is the idea of Australia and the world economy. So it's really important to understand like the cause and effect. So what I mentioned before. So we're going to have a look at a couple of examples of this. The first one here, and I'd say like the most important one, just because it's one of the questions that students typically do worst at, is just making sure that you're across the terms of trade and you'd be able to answer a question like this. So we're looking at this question here, refer to the graph of the terms of trade and explain or outline one factor that might explain the trend over the past 2 years. It's only worth 2 marks. This is a really, really hard question though. So let's look at how VCAR wanted students to answer it. So basically, this question has 2 different components. First of all, knowing what the terms of trade are, being able to say what the trend is. And then the second part is knowing something that might have led to that trend. So in this case here, we were dealing in 2016. So basically, I guess they were looking at the last 2 years, which was just this downward bit of the terms of trade. So lots of students made that sort of link. They saw that the terms of trade had decreased, but they didn't necessarily know what the terms of trade were. So it was hard to come up with a factor, which is absolutely fair enough, right? If you were to ask like anyone without studying economics this question, they'd have to be very, very lucky or have some like other knowledge. It'd be really, really hard to answer. So a possible response could have been that the terms of trade measures the prices of exports relative to the prices of imports. So the good response defined the like terms of trade. And then they outlined the trend that the terms of trade had fallen due to the fall in prices received for commodity exports, such as iron ore. So this is the reason that they've given. You could have come up with any reason for a decrease in the price of exports relative to imports. So a lack of demand for commodities like iron ore is one example, but higher levels or demand for imports could be another example. You could definitely tailor it to what you've sort of seen within the economy. But in this case here, this question mentions that the level of demand for mining exports was very high. However, since there has been basically a lot of investment in production around mining, that has meant that there has been a surplus of a bunch of minerals, so the price fell, leading to a decline in the terms of trade. Again, there'd be other answers that you could use here. The key thing is that they've defined it, they've shown the trend, and they've come up with some reason why that trend exists. And you don't have to necessarily nail down the exact reason, as long as the reason is somewhat reasonable. And it's true, like there has been a trend in X, Y, and Z that might have led to this. That's totally fine. That's why we use language like may have, could have in economics. So we're not necessarily committing that 100% this is what caused this. This may have contributed to this. So definitely don't be afraid to put in the knowledge that you do have, even if you're not entirely sure if it definitely did lead to whatever. The next style of question that I think is really important to highlight is the exchange rate. So it's important to know how it's determined. It's basically just supply and demand, but I feel like anything involved in international stuff becomes a bit more complicated. But this is a question that popped up in a 2014 exam. So the question here is to describe a factor that might have led to the change in the dollar. And this is like a hypothetical. So we don't actually need something over the past 2 years. We can use some hypothetical thing. So this is when we need to know those links between different parts of the economy. So the trend, first of all, we need to look at is it looks like the Australian dollar has decreased in value. So we can see that relative to the US dollar, In 2013, it was basically dollar for dollar with the US, but ever since then, the US dollar has decreased, or the Australian dollar has decreased relative to the US dollar. So each AUD buys less USD. You might have noticed that if you were like doing online shopping in the US, for instance, your dollar doesn't necessarily go very far. And it looks like something that costs like, 50 US dollars costs like 3,000 Australian dollars, which like isn't true, but it feels like that. And we've also got the trade weighted index, which is measuring a basket of currencies. So we can see that that's declined as well. So we need to come up with a factor that might have affected or decreased the value for the Australian dollar. And remember, we want to be looking at things that kind of relate to supply and demand. So something that would have caused a decrease in the Australian dollar would be lower demand for the Australian dollar. So maybe countries are purchasing less of our exports. I think that might be the answer, but you could go with another answer as well. For instance, if we were to have lower levels of interest rates, that would cause less investment in Australia and therefore less demand for our dollar. So lower interest rates is also an option. So basically, this was something that was given a lot of media attention, which was why they decided to put this in the exam. Basically, the high scoring responses explained that trend, saying that there was like a depreciation and basically that the value of the dollar decreased. And there was a couple of reasons that you could have used to show how the dollar decreased, which might have been either demand decreasing, so lower economic activity overseas, lower demand for our exports reflected by lower terms of trade, or less interest rates, which deterred investors investing. And on the supply side, we could look at things that would improve the supply of the Australian dollar, which would also decrease the value. And as you can see, there's lots of options. So this is an example of a question where there's plenty of different things that you could say. I guess it's a good idea to make sure you understand enough relationships in economics to be able to come up with some of these. You definitely did not have to come up with all of them, but having some reasonable explanation is really important. And this is a hard question. So if you didn't get one of these or multiple of these, that's absolutely reasonable. But we want to work towards being able to describe these trends towards the exam. Cool. The next question kind of relates. It's looking at how the changes in the exchange rate that we saw affect the different goals. So again, these slides are available. I would have a look through this, but basically this question I popped in here because it shows that we need to know what affects the exchange rate, but also how the exchange rate affects other things. So you really want to have that sort of cause and effect relationship super clear in your mind in order to be able to best respond to these questions here. And here's some high scoring responses. The next couple of questions, and I'm kind of running out of time for this at the moment, but yeah, it's sort of relating to budgetary policy. So make sure you're able to answer all of these sort of questions here, questions about the stabilizers, the stance, outcomes and interactions with the different types of policies and comparing monetary and budgetary policy. As you can see, there's lots of different questions that will ask you to come up with a budgetary policy measure. And this is a really good thing that I pulled out of a 2018 examination report, which kind of gives you a bit of a structure in terms of how to structure a question that asks you to reference a specific measure. It's a bit tax specific, so you can kind of ignore some of these things, but I think it's quite a good overview. Awesome. Need to know how to finance a deficit. I mentioned this before. This is a question that was used. Again, you will have access to these slides. But yeah, I guess it's good to be able to answer those, and here's some examples there. We've got some questions that you might get on monetary policy. Make sure you know what monetary policy has looked like recently. Spoiler alert, very low interest rates. Make sure you're really aware of that monetary policy stance, that should say, and the impact of monetary policy on the economy via transmission mechanisms. So in order to draw the link between changes in the cash rate, which we can see here, and AD, we need to use transmission mechanisms. In one of these exams, I believe it was in 2018, the question kind of revolves around this, and they basically give you all of the different transmission mechanisms and how decreases in the cash rate cause high levels of AD. So this is a really good examiner's report to reference to make sure you've brushed up on that content. Make sure you're aware of the stance, the strengths and weaknesses, and those sorts of questions that ask you to compare and contrast. And when it comes to AS questions, I guess this is kind of towards the end, but make sure you've got different answers for AS and AD questions, and make sure you're able to recognize the different questions and be able to answer the AS questions from a viewpoint of aggregate supply side factors. So looking at the sort of more structural elements of the economy and how they relate to growth, unemployment, and inflation. So again, I've got some questions there that you're free to look at in your own time. But on that note, we will jump into a quick break again. So we've got another video to play, and then we'll have another 10-minute break. So let me get off this pen mode so I can play the video. Awesome.
Hi, my name's Emma. I work on the equity sales desk at UBS, focusing on hedge funds. My biggest career highlight to date was hosting a panel with over 150 clients who were based around the globe with one of my colleagues a few weeks ago, presenting on one of my pieces of work. At university, I studied commerce with a focus on French, data science, and finance. And in high school, French was one of my favourite subjects. Advice to my younger self would be to make the most of your youth and just ask as many questions as possible, really leveraging the fact that you don't need to know all the answers. All the best with your studies.
All right, awesome. So we'll jump into a break, got some music. So I guess we will meet back at 3:43 to jump out of the break. All right, amazing. So come back from our little break now and jump into our next little study tip video that we've got.
So procrastination is probably one of the things that makes us feel the worst. Like when we know that we're not doing something that we should be doing, we feel terrible. You hear people talk about the fact that, oh, I'm just procrastinating, I'm not getting started, and how down and how flat that makes us feel. By the end of this video, you will have a different way of thinking about, a different way of feeling about procrastination, which is totally normal and totally human. But when you think about it from this angle, it changes your relationship to it. So really important to remember is that fact that procrastination is actually totally human. We all do it, and getting awareness of what's going on in our head when we're doing it can really help us to have some agency in how we deal with it. So if you think about it, it's not actually the procrastination itself that makes us feel bad. It's actually the fact that we beat ourselves up for procrastinating that makes us feel bad. We are all human, we all procrastinate. It's the degree to which we punish ourselves for procrastinating that has us feel horrible. And when this happens, we kind of redirect our attention to procrastinating and how bad we are for procrastinating, and we actually lose sight of the thing that we should be working on. In many ways, we self-sabotage. Like we get so focused on beating ourselves up for procrastinating that we literally spend that energy and don't give it to the thing that we actually need to be doing. And unfortunately, once we go down that negative path, our minds are kind of hardwired to loop in that negativity, which completely distracts us from what we should be doing. And so we actually send ourselves down a path where we actually don't get the results that we want. What I would love you to leave this with is that if you can acknowledge this mechanism and how this plays out in your life, literally that just having that self-awareness can shift your relationship for how this works out in your life. Because when you can see that you're focusing on the fact that you're procrastinating, which is distracting you from what you should really be doing, something shifts there. I really hope this helps. Let me know.
All right, awesome. So we've got a couple of questions up on the Menti at the moment, which are some really fantastic ones. So we'll jump into answering those. So we'll answer a couple now, and then we'll leave a couple towards the end. But definitely feel free to keep the sort of questions coming in. The first one is about multiple choice questions, like in the SACs, that they tend to be a bit broader in terms of knowledge. So I definitely agree. I think some multi-choice questions can be very, very difficult because they kind of push the boundaries of what's actually in the study design itself. So you might have ones that especially relate to more technical aspects of the study design. In my opinion, I think that they do keep it quite similar in the exam. But of course, the sort of caveat on that is that in the exam, they literally cannot ask you anything that's not in the study design itself. So if your SACs specifically and the way your teacher writes your SACs are a little bit beyond what's in the study design and might kind of be on the border of not really being accessible, you're not going to have that level of complexity in the exam. That being said, there are some aspects that are not typically assessed in the exam, like long answer questions, but are typically assessed in the multi-choice. So one really good example of that is questions that relate to how monetary policy is enacted. You typically will not get a question that will ask you a really in-depth method of how they enact monetary policy and change the cash rate via open market operations, but that is a very common multiple choice question. That being said, they could totally ask you that in a short answer question. In my opinion, it would be a little bit mean. It is good to have that knowledge because you need it for the multi-choice questions, but you are more likely to see some of those like more technical and complex ones that they don't believe students will necessarily be able to answer super concisely in the short answer or long answer section. They will typically move those towards the multi-choice. So I'd say definitely be prepared for anything in the multi-choice because it does give them a bit of freedom to ask about things that are a bit more complicated. But of course, as long as you've looked at the study design and checked off all those points, there shouldn't be any surprises. Awesome. The next question that I wanted to sort of ask and sort of float to our Ivy and Serena is the question, if I can find it, about the number of practice exams that you would recommend doing. So I guess Ivy, do you want to take this one, and then Serena, you can add?
Yeah, so whilst I was doing VCE, I did do about well, it differs between every exam that every unit that I did. Oh, sorry, subject, VCE subject. Oh, it's been so long. But yeah, it really differed between the every subject I did. So for instance, for biology, I did all the previous available biology exams provided by VCA, as well as some that were done by tutoring companies.
Okay.
So yeah, I pretty much tried to do as many as I could for most of my subjects. Yeah, just depending on what was available to me.
Yeah, that's a good point you make though, because there are definitely some subjects that have more exams than others. So biology is a really good example. There's tons of previous exams for that. I think some subjects, so I know English, there was a new study design, economics is a new study design as well. You've got a little bit less to work with, but definitely agree with those external companies, getting your hands on the more exams is really helpful. What about you, Serena? What was your sort of experience with practice exams?
Yeah, so for practice exams, I try to find on the internet just whole practice paper banks, and there would be a lot from maybe different schools of trial papers. I'm not sure if it's the same for VC, maybe it is, but also just doing the ones that the education board has given you, because it's got those guidelines that are very structured and good for if that comes up in the real exam, you know exactly what points to hit and stuff like that. But also, yeah, finding those external sites, and they always have places where people just upload practice exams. And to answer the question, how many practice exams is recommended? I would say some people have the capability of pumping out maybe 2 or 3 practice exams a day, but definitely some people like me weren't able to do that. So just like kind of maybe say like once every 2 days you do a practice exam, because that allows you to mark the paper and also kind of like look at the questions you got wrong, maybe adding it to your wrong questions bank, or just like comparing answers with your friends even. So I think that that it's very relative between each person. So it like you can do 2 to 3 per day, that's like quantity, but some people might not see the value in that because you're not like properly evaluating them, but for some people that works. So yeah, it's just based on your own preference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like it totally depends, on how you like to revise best, and also the subject. I found like for some subjects you can do like tons of practice exams, and like the more the better. I guess like I definitely don't agree with the whole like do 50 practice exams for a 50 study tour, because I think that's just like way too much. And it's just like too much focus on that quantity rather than the quality. So I definitely like don't agree with just doing so many that you just get absolutely bogged down with practice exams. In my opinion, with economics, there's definitely like an earlier plateau when it comes to the exams. And that's because with economics, I feel like the examiners can't be as creative with the questions they come up with, because there's a bit of limited content, honestly. So once you've done like a few practice exams, you probably will notice that they start to become more and more similar. And my teacher really did not agree with like doing tons of practice exams when you've done the questions over and over again. She really emphasized like, look, if you've done this practice, if you're doing a new practice exam and maybe you've seen this particular question like 3 or 4 times and you've already had a shot at answering it and you're pretty happy with it, maybe like either not bothering to answer it or just kind of answering it but not getting it marked by someone else because you're already pretty like comfortable with it. So it's definitely really dependent on like how you do best. I'd say for economics, I kind of did something similar to what Serena was talking about. I think I did them every 2 to 3 days over my study period. So I think I maybe did probably like 10 to 12 total. But again, like by the end of that, there wasn't really much additional value, I would say. But for other like subjects, I would say that like generally people at my school would have done much more than like that. For instance, like a methods kind of thing, because there's 2 different exams. I think people were encouraged to do more. That being said, like, again, I'm not a super big advocate of doing so many. As long as you're still getting value and you're still learning from those exams, that's all you can really ask for. But by no means do I think that you should be aiming for 100% on all those exams or doing 50, because that's just ridiculous, in my opinion. We'll answer one more before we jump into it. I might answer this one at the end. But there was a really good question that I saw, which was this one here. So I guess this would be good to have Ivy and Serena chat about too. So I guess, Ivy, did you want to chat about this question here?
Yeah, the way I did it during year 12, so I definitely believe there should be a good balance between study and leisure. Like, you don't want to be so stressed out that you're only thinking about like the exams upcoming. And I feel like it definitely tanks like your ability to learn more. Like you'd just be super stressed out about trying to improve that. In the end, you don't really learn much new content. So I guess dedicating like some time out of a day just to study, like it doesn't have to be a long time, just like to review like content, like just take like 30 minutes or an hour one day if you wanted to dedicate that whole day for just leisure. Is a good way to keep like leisure time and study time, especially if you are feeling stressed out.
Yep, awesome.
Yeah, so to add on to that, I would say you should echoing Ivy, definitely balance your study and leisure, but also think about what leisure that you choose to do, because maybe, for example, if your form of leisure is maybe watching Netflix, that might be a dangerous route to go through, because you might end up binge watching like maybe a whole season of something and then you'll feel really unproductive after. So just keep in mind what you do choose as a form of leisure, maybe doing some sport, saying like walking outside even, or playing tennis with your family, just something something that seems productive for you and also generates some productive output would also be a good way to just make sure you don't feel guilty about, taking those breaks. And so I think that's a good way to see how to balance study and leisure.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like 100% on the guilt-free breaks kind of thing. I think a lot of the time, like we just like feel guilty, even though like, you might have like done a lot of study in a particular day, but maybe you didn't tick off your overly ambitious to-do list, and then you just feel like crap basically for the rest of the day. So I think like really making sure you prioritize having that time to do nothing. I think like it was like mentioned at some point, the time that you do take on like breaks is productive, because it's kind of giving your brain some time to refresh, some time to process that information, even if it isn't at the forefront of your mind. And for that, like taking breaks and getting good sleep is just so important. Like cannot understate the importance of sleep when it comes to memory, and consolidating what you've been learning. Like if like that isn't a good enough reason to make sure you're sleeping during that exam study period, I'm not really sure what would be, because it's just so important. And I guess like what you kind of mentioned, Serena, in terms of like what sort of like fun you choose to have. I've kind of like heard this mentioned on a podcast or something, but like prioritizing like high quality fun. So instead of taking like a bunch of like 5-minute like TikTok scrolls, or maybe more realistically like half an hour throughout the day, where you kind of like, they're just like little breaks. They're not really that satisfying. Like it's not that much of like a chill out time if you're just like scrolling on your phone in between study. If you can like block out a time to like go on a walk, have a nice dinner with like a friend or something, have like a nice Zoom call, because dinner with a friend isn't really like possible at the moment, but have a virtual catch up, or do something fun like that. That's just like so much more valuable, and I feel like it refreshes me more than like a bit of a TikTok binge, low-key. So yeah, awesome. So we'll answer some of these questions at the end, and please keep them coming. We'll have a bit of time at the end of the session. I'm just going to jump into the last little block of content that we've got. Before I do though, just wanted to give you a heads up that we do have an exam hack session, which you can book to receive in like the school holidays that we've got, which are happening right now, to receive 10% off. So you can head to this link here. It's happening on the 11th of October, and it's all about avoiding sort of panicking in that exam and doing your best when working under pressure, which I think is definitely some advice that we could all use. And yeah, I guess I will ask you to complete the survey in a little bit, but just as a heads up, we do have a survey, so I'll come back to that. Awesome. So the last little block of today's little series, we looked at study techniques, we looked at content and overview of the study design dot points and just things to look out for and make sure you've revised. And then we looked at some really important questions to practice. The last really key thing about the economics exam is having that focus on preparation. So we really want to be making sure we're nice and prepared for the upcoming exam. And like I mentioned, it's not always as simple as just remembering all the content, but you do need to know a little bit more about the other stuff. So the key things, I guess, between now and the exam is to make sure you've developed a knowledge of the Australian economy over the last 2 years. Hopefully, this is something that you have had a bit of a look at over the year. That being said, it's definitely not too late. So this is definitely something, if you even read like, a few weeks of like a random news article here and there, and you have a look at those stats, it's absolutely something you can prepare yourself for and be a little bit, you don't have to be like a complete expert. That's not necessarily your job yet, but you do need to have a little bit of an idea, and it's good to just make sure you do that prep earlier. The next would be to make sure you've got a roadmap between now and the exam. So I'll chat a bit about what that might entail for you. So in terms of the knowledge about the Australian economy, I've probably said this about 5 times in this like revision series, so apologies, but this is what I kind of specifically mean. So the information that you want to have are, of course, on those 3 goals. So you want to really make sure you know what the trend is and what the actual numbers have been for inflation, unemployment, and growth. You want to talk about some key macroeconomic factors. For these, I would kind of prioritize, number 1, the things that you think will most commonly pop up. So some really obscure measure of the economy might not be so helpful to know about, but you basically want to look at things like the interest rate, the cash rate, consumer and business confidence. That's super common, super easy to talk about. The wage price index, again, that's something that's really commonly talked about. Productivity, oil prices, for instance. I think I had like some tracker of the number, like the price of the like oil barrels in my like little statistics like flashcard deck. What the budget deficit is, like big one, I guess, as a spoiler alert. And like I looked at the budget deficit to GDP ratio, but you can kind of look at whatever. And then for the world economy, you want to know what the terms of trade, the exchange rates, the CAD and overseas interest rates have looked like in a general sense. So that's a lot of stuff. My best piece of advice would be to organize it in a way that works for you. You could definitely have it in sort of like, I don't know, a Word document kind of table form. I'd say that's probably like an easy way of doing it, where you have like the indicator, maybe the definition, what it was now, what it was a year ago and what it was 2 years ago, and maybe even a graph of what it's looked like. For me, that's like plenty of information. That's like all the information you'd need about these indicators to talk about them in a very like informed way, in my opinion. So to find the information about the Australian economy, the best possible resources you can use are probably the ABS and the RBA. So they've basically got a bunch of information on recent economic stats. The RBA have these things called chart packs, which I've kind of scattered throughout the slides today. They look like this. They are super helpful. And the reason why I say they're super helpful is because a lot of the time the graphs you see in the exam look eerily exactly the same as these, like maybe formatted a bit differently, but you'll probably, like, likelihood is if you scroll through the RBA chart pack, one of those graphs will be in your end of year exam, at least in my opinion, from what I've seen. So it's always good to just like have a look at them. Of course, if it's something really obscure that you've never heard of in your life, it's probably not going to be on the exam. But if you've had a look at these, that's a really helpful thing to have looked at going into the exam. And especially looking at them with an idea of, oh, why did GDP growth dip at this point? Why has underemployment skyrocketed so much, but it's like way higher than unemployment, which is basically what Nick was speaking about at the start of today's session. So a lot of these things are really like quite clearly reflected in the graphs. So if you've seen those graphs before, that is super helpful going into the exam. And they've also got statements on like what monetary policy has been enacted, as well as the snapshots. And another is the budgets that have been published by the government. So this is the ABS. They, I think, recently did up their website, so it looks really nice now. You can see like a bunch of nice graphs. So if you wanted to screenshot those graphs and put it in your little table for how the economy has been going, great idea. That's what I did. I screenshotted them and put them in my flashcards, but a table works great as well. This is the RBA. So this is what you see if you Google the RBA and you click on their website. You can see like what the cash rate is and inflation. And within the RBA, we can like go up to chart pack to find those graphs. And in the media releases, they release the information about the cash rate or like interest rates. There's lots of stuff on the RBA's website, so it's nice to have a bit of a look through if you're feeling like that. Again, the RBA chart packs, so helpful, really useful as a resource. And the last one is like government budgets. So you should be able to, for each budget, search up like budget 2020 to 2019 in like Google Chrome or something. And it should come up with a PDF. I really like using those sort of budget PDF overviews. And as you can see, this is like something from the chart pack. You can see what the budget balance is supposed to be as a percent of GDP. So you can see it was heading towards the direction of a surplus, and now it will be, and it is, a large budget deficit. And the other statistics sources that I use, this one is like tradingeconomics.com. It's kind of random. I feel like this one is like the first one that pops up if you search like Australia GDP annual growth rate. I used these because you can kind of customize the graphs, but I think the ABS is kind of nice as well. So do whichever one you feel like. All right, so that's kind of the statistics. Moving on to, I guess, like what your exam plan would want to be. So it's basically a good idea at this point to have a few strategies in place for how you're going to go about the exam, number one, but when also like when you get into the exam, how you're going to go about the multi-choice and the written response questions. So I would recommend, and this is where your practice comes in handy, having a really good strategy about what you want to do in the exam. So maybe you know what time the exam is going to be held at. I don't exactly know if it's like being released yet. But basically, if you know that the exam starts at X time and you have X minutes of reading time, I want to be finished this section by like 2:35 and this section by like 3 something. So having that stepped out can be really helpful, help keep you on track. I didn't do that, but I know a lot of my friends do that for uni exams. So again, depends on what you do or what you want to do. You want to choose if you want to do the multi-choice or the short answer / long answer first. I personally prefer doing the written responses. What I would do is I would do the written responses and I would skip any of the ones I didn't know how to answer or wasn't completely comfortable answering with. Then I would do the multi-choice, which was like a fun break in the middle because, you know, multi-choice, super fun. And then I would go back and look at the written responses and I'd do all the ones that I had skipped to come back to at the end. And make sure you either allow yourself some time at the end to check your responses or have an idea of what you're going to do if you've got X amount of time left at the end. So I would definitely recommend that. There's also some other like strategies that you can employ throughout the exam. So in the multiple choice section, I would say you want to try and maximize your marks. You should hopefully be viewing the multi-choice question as it's not really like an easy 15 marks, but it is easier than writing a 15-mark question. At least that's what I thought about it. So you want to do like the best you possibly can in this section. That being said, some of the questions are hard. That's totally fine. Sometimes they'll even award marks to everyone because they've accidentally made the question too hard or ambiguous. So just know that with the multi-choice, it's hard, but everyone's in the same boat. You just want to do the classic things. Make sure you read all the options. Sometimes it might be a bit of a giveaway that you've misread the question. Get comfortable with just some really basic calculations. So you do not get a calculator in the economics exam, but that doesn't mean you're going to get something insanely hard to do maths with. I'm terrible at mental maths, but the maths in economics 3-4 isn't too bad. Like I can do it, which counts for a lot in my opinion, but you just want to make sure you're aware of the percentage change formula. So it's basically the difference divided by the old value, or how I used to remember it was new minus old divided by old and times 100 because it's a percentage. Look it up, just Google image it, you'll have it in your notes, all good. Make sure you remember the calculations and the definitions for the labor force measures. So unemployment is the amount of unemployed people over the the labor force, which is unemployed and employed, not all of the people who could possibly work. So you just want to be aware of those little technicalities, and also make sure you're able to do an annualized rate from a quarterly rate. So if you get a quarterly rate of 1% increase in GDP, to annualize it, you times it by 4. For some reason, this was mind-boggling. I had no idea how to do this, but just get good at timesing stuff by 4. My go-to is doubling it and doubling it again because I am like really bad at mental maths. So that's what I did if I came across that. Multi-choice like question technique is to sort of eliminate answers as you go. Make sure you are scribbling all over the multi-choice section. In my opinion, that is good. And look for answers that contradict each other, or answers that are too definitive. So if you've got like an always in there, or a must, or a will, or, you know, those kind of very definitive kind of words, those are typically not the answers. Again, that's a really blanket statement, so that might not be true at all times, but it's definitely something to look out for as a bit of a red flag. For the written responses, what I would recommend is to read the question, answer it, and read it again. I'm personally one of those people, I feel like there's a lot of us, that if I'm in an exam situation, I will really like skim read the question. I probably don't even read it properly, but I'm so like worried about not being able to finish in time that I want to write my answer, maybe before I've even read the question properly. So I definitely recommend slow yourself down, like try and highlight the keywords of the question. And once you've answered it, read the question again. Make sure you've answered it. You might not remember what the question was, but you'll typically remember what you've written. So it's best to just go back and make sure you've answered all parts of that question. Make sure you pay attention to the mark allocation, really helpful in terms of structuring your answer. In my opinion, don't worry about going over the lines. You do have that space at the end of the paper that you can use. If it's one line, I wouldn't bother. If you've had to scribble out some parts of your exam, I'd go ahead and use the spare space at the end to make your exam book nice and neat. I would say that, I guess examiners do not choose better answers based on neatness and handwriting and all of that. But if your answer's structured in such a way that there's lots of crossing out and it's very difficult to read, it's going to be harder for them to mark. So you want to make it as easy for them to mark as possible. So if in doubt and you're kind of worried that it's a bit of a mess, just rewrite it at the end. And try to not invest too much time into questions you're less confident in. I would say avoid excessive skipping, which is probably not the most useful piece of advice. Skip questions, but don't skip them too much. But what I mean is if you think you can stick it out and it's not a nice question to answer, but you can do it, I'd recommend doing that question. If you have no idea, I'd come back. Hopefully you'll get some sort of bit of inspiration, or some other bit of the exam will remind you that, oh, this is the answer to this, or something like that. But don't worry about not answering all questions. In my opinion, and certainly with my class, I remember walking out of the exam hall or whatever it was, and there was definitely some of my classmates who couldn't answer certain parts, and that's totally fine. It's a really hard exam to answer everything to. Know that if you haven't quite finished the exam, there's lots of people in the same boat. You've put all the information that you could there, and that's the best that you can possibly do, and you'll still do well, because it's a hard exam. So that's absolutely fair enough. All right, so now we're kind of at the sort of stage coming towards the end of the revision series. So I'll get you guys to answer this evaluation question. So Ivy has sent a survey link into the chat for everyone. So make sure you click on that link. I'll give you a couple of minutes to go ahead and answer that survey. And also if you've got any burning questions as well, please do pop them into the Menti. We'll be going into the Menti Q&A bit at the end. So go ahead, answer that question for the next couple of minutes. And it looks like Ivy has sent the link again, so you can click on it in the chat. And while we're at it, you can also pop into the Menti your confidence level about the economics exam now, following the end of the, or coming towards the end of the session. I guess while we wait, in the meantime, do you guys Ivy or Serena have some extra study tips that you've thought of on top of any of the slides or anything else we've gone through today?
I definitely believe that the study tips you mentioned earlier were really applicable to other units as well. So if you guys needed any help with that, definitely refer back to those ones that Bridget did mention before.
Yeah. And also I think on active recall, there are a number of different ways you can probably use active recall. I think it's probably the best way of I guess memorizing content for especially economics or other content heavy subjects, maybe biology, and maybe, as Bridget mentioned, you can do the flashcards on Quizlet, and also maybe like Anki, or also even just being very traditional. You can just write out like definitions on a piece of paper and just keep writing them out until you've memorized them. That's also like just a very traditional method that I also used. Just to also practice how fast your handwriting is. So yeah, I think that's active recall is definitely a cornerstone of economics and studying for it.
Yeah, that's a good point about like combining active recall with the like writing as well. Like that's a very good point. If you can sort of write out questions for yourself and be able to answer those, that is helpful as well. I know like another sort of piece of advice around active recall that I've seen in terms of like a collaborative sense is like getting your classmates together and writing each other some like practice questions and practice exams. So I guess like it's like an online technique that you could use might be having like a Google Doc. So that would work from an online learning point. You might want to create a Google Doc with your class, and you can share questions and like what you would say answer them with. And another thing that you can use sort of like Google Docs and shared resources for is creating some examples of those like pieces about the economy over the last couple of years and budgetary policy techniques. I guess like I think with our class we did have a shared doc even before COVID, but I think it's even more useful to sort of collate those resources together and kind of use your time most effectively and help each other out a little bit coming up to the exam. Awesome. So it looks like we've kind of leveled out with the like confidence quiz question we've got here. So good to see that you guys are feeling a bit more confident leading up to the exam. Like absolutely get, like I was super nervous leading up to my exam. I think the worst thing about my economics exam was it was the day after my English one. So I was like absolutely like done with writing. So like that in addition to kind of worrying about the content and all of that. But I'm sure kind of like online unknownness of it all has like definitely contributed. So I think like you guys are doing amazing. Like I don't know how I would have done online school, honestly. I probably would have found it really, really difficult to like keep motivated. So you guys are like absolutely killing it. The fact that you've made it this far in the year is absolutely a massive kudos to you all. So yeah, hopefully your confidence keeps on improving. But I suppose just know that the fact that you've kind of stuck it out for a whole year with online schooling just really goes to show like the effort that you've been able to put in over the year. So absolutely smashing it. All right, awesome. Let me just double check. I don't think I had one last slide before we jump into the Q&A bit, but this is just to have a bit of a roadmap given that the exam is approaching. So the roadmap isn't put in place and like the sort of countdown shouldn't be there to like scare you. I know like some of my teachers would be like, oh, like X amount of weeks until the exam. It'd be like, oh no. I guess with the roadmap, it's just good to set yourself a couple of like checkpoints and have some little goals that you can kind of achieve leading up to the final exam. I think like sometimes it can be really hard to have that focus being all on that exam as like the sort of one goal that you have to hit, because that places like a lot of pressure on that exam. And it's like, oh, you know, like I can't relax until I have completed the exam and I'm completely done with school. What I would recommend doing is have like a couple of goals and some checkpoints to hit as you lead up to that exam, and you get a little bit of a sense of accomplishment as you go, and kind of having that confidence that you know that you're working towards that exam, and you're sort of putting yourself in the position to do the best that you possibly can. I'd highlight the night before the exam and sort of the few days before. I would recommend taking your foot off the accelerator a little bit. For me, I'm definitely someone who gets like a bit stressed leading up to the exam, and probably the revision that I do in that time right before it isn't super effective. I think my focus is more so on making sure I'm like sleeping, eating well, living my best life, so I'm in like the best possible headspace as possible. So I definitely like recommend that. And yeah, the best thing, like, which I haven't included here, but Ivy and Serena and I were talking about it at the start, is like the holidays at the end of year 12 is the best. You've got like no obligations, you're completely done, and it's super exciting. So maybe chuck on your little roadmap what fun things you're going to do after the exams are over. All right, awesome. So let's jump over to the final Q&A questions that we've got for today's lesson. The first one here is about the biggest marker like question on the exam. So for instance, like the business exam has a 10-mark question. This is a really fantastic question, and it kind of highlights the more difficult aspects of things surrounding like economics. The answer to this is that there's not really an answer. So sorry, not really satisfying. The economics like examiners can pretty much throw whatever in the exam. There are definitely some longer questions. So I would say like you could probably expect a question that's maybe worth 8 marks, but what that question is a little bit harder to tell. I don't know how the business like sort of exams mark those 10-mark questions and if there's a set structure. But what I would say for economics is that for your larger questions, there is no set structure. You basically want to be using your structuring techniques based on the question that is being asked. So you want to be having a look at some of those bigger questions leading up to the exam and going, okay, like I would allocate 2 marks to this, 2 marks to this, 2 marks to this, and something like that. And the best resource that you can do to prepare yourself for those bigger kind of like not fun questions to answer is to practice them and look at the examination reports and see how they've been marked in the past. And of course, if you can find someone like your teacher to actually like mark those like bigger questions for you, that's really helpful too. But in my opinion, I think sometimes like the larger questions can be quite intimidating, but they're typically a bit more accessible in my opinion. So even though I hate writing, like lots of writing, so I didn't love them, but I find that those sorts of questions are a little bit more in line with what you've learned. And if you look at it like 2 4-mark questions, for instance, you'll probably be quite ready and sort of all good to go and answer that question. The next question here is about like the definitions of AS, AD, and GDP. So you're absolutely right when you sort of like say that they're all equal. So basically, I guess what you're referring to is that we can measure the amount of production in the economy by looking at the level of income, by looking at the like value of the stuff being produced, or by looking at like in terms of production, or by looking at what people are consuming. So those are the different methods of calculating GDP. I would probably try and keep that separate from the definitions of AS, AD, and AD rather. So there are like sort of 3 distinct definitions here. We know that we can work out GDP by looking at AS and AD, or like, I guess, production and consumption, but we typically want to keep them distinct and like separately defined because, you know, we have like a different AS curve and a different AD curve. So I guess like for AS, you want to be looking at the definition being the quantity of goods and services that firms are willing and able to produce in the economy. Whereas AD, we're looking at the total value of Australian produced final goods and services in the economy that's produced over a certain period of time. And that's kind of a bit more similar to GDP, I suppose. So I'd say like maybe for this AD and GDP are quite similar, but you have a different definition for AS. So hopefully that was clear enough. The next question here is like, what trends do I think will appear on this year's exam? And whether they might mention that we experienced a temporary current account surplus due to China's investment in iron. So this is a really great question. So like clearly like the fact that you're answering or asking this question rather shows that you kind of know what's up. Hopefully like that means that you would be prepared for anything. I would say that like, I don't know about like how good I'd be at guessing things. I think it's like a bit hard to predict what might be in an exam. What I would advise students to do is not put all of your eggs in one basket. So I definitely would recommend knowing what the economy looked like pre-COVID and some other like indicators there. I think when it comes to like the temporary current account surplus, it's helpful to know why that was the case. So you should like have an idea of like why there is a bit of a current account surplus when it's been historically a deficit. I think that's a really valid point that you make because a lot of the previous VCA exams have asked, why do we have a current account deficit? So it's definitely like reasonable for them to ask, why would we have a current account surplus? But again, I'd recommend make sure you've got a holistic view of those 2 years of the economy you need to know about, know what the government's sort of intention was with policy pre-COVID. I think the worst thing that could happen is if all of your examples are COVID related and the question wasn't COVID related, that would be very hard to answer. So yes, I would say like in terms of predicting trends, I would say I predict all of them in terms of just a really good overview of the last 2 years. And of course, I guess like COVID-19, like budgetary policy and all of that, that's something that I think is super relevant as well. Cool. Is it worth it mentioning policy from 2019? Kind of like just mentioned this. I'd say like absolutely yes. It is worth at least like knowing about it. Maybe the question doesn't ask you that, but there's kind of like no harm having a bit of extra knowledge about what policy looked like before that. And I think it is useful to know the kind of economic position that Australia was in pre-2019. But yeah, like maybe I'll just ask Ivy and Serena before I answer this last one here if they have any like extra comments on like predicting stuff that might be within exams, or just like any general comments or ideas. If not, all good. But yeah, Ivy?
I think personally, with my exams, I wasn't too great at predicting what was on the exam, I guess. But I think a good way is to definitely ask your teachers, since they have been teaching, that subject for who knows how long, but they definitely would have more of a greater view of what could be on the next exam. So I reckon definitely ask your teachers about what they think and what they predict about that.
Yeah. Also, what Bridget said about not putting all your eggs in one basket. There might be a lot of, maybe you'll come across some forums where people predict what type of questions it's going to be on the exam, but then always take those predictions with a grain of salt, because obviously they're not more qualified to speak about those predictions than you are. So just use your best judgment and see, maybe like last year's paper, it's less likely that they'll put similar questions this year, but that's not always the case. They might do repeat questions if the question was done badly last year, for example. So have a look at, just have a broad kind of perspective on when you're predicting questions.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think like you're totally right. I saw a lot of stuff on like online about what people thought there might be in certain exams, and like people can kind of talk at length about what they think might be in an exam. I think a really good example of, and this wasn't economics, but an exam that was just a complete curveball, was my biology exam. So I did biology in year 11, just to get a bit of a head start on my like year 12 subjects. And for that exam, like it was a new study design. So the teachers had lots of different ideas about what questions they'd likely ask. There was a lot of emphasis on learning about this particular topic that was really, really big. So we had a lot of class time on that. And the actual exam itself was just completely different. So it didn't cover that topic at all. There was like one multi-choice question, and they had some really interesting question types, like this sort of reading comprehension style question that no one had really ever seen before. And I think that kind of set a lot of people back in that exam, because it was just way different to what they had expected. So I definitely would recommend sort of being really flexible with what you think might be on that exam. Just for that reason, you might get a crazy kind of curveball exam. No, everyone is in the same boat, but just keeping your options open, I suppose, in terms of the content that you learn is probably going to put you in the best position, rather than sort of like betting on a particular topic, in my opinion. So the next question that we've got is like asking about, there's a SAC in week 2 of term 4, which is maybe a little bit late. I think my last SAC would have been in the same like time period as well though. But I know a lot of schools try and finish the content by term 3, and whether it's manageable to complete that content again and use active recall and spaced repetition in time for the exam. Short answer would be yes. So the fact that you've got that sort of SAC means that you're preparing for that specific topic, so that you can kind of tick that one off the list. You don't have to worry about revising that too much. But I'd say when it comes to active recall and spaced repetition, the fact that you've already learned the stuff for that exam at the start of the year means that you'll pick it up more quickly. So in my opinion, it should take you less time to get all of that knowledge back into your brain in time for the exam. But I would recommend incorporating some practice exams in with that active recall and spaced repetition. And that would just be an absolute killer combination to prepare you for that exam. But absolutely, I think that is definitely achievable. But yeah, I guess that's pretty much it in terms of all we've got time for in today's session. Thank you guys so much for joining on. Again, like I said, it's probably been like an incredibly hard year. Online learning is just not ideal, and it's really, really difficult to keep up that motivation. I mean, the fact that you're here today really shows that motivation and that drive. So absolutely keep it up. Please, like we've all kind of been talking about today, make sure you take care of yourself. The classic, it's a marathon, not a sprint. But yeah, other than that, thank you so much. Good luck for your preparation for economics and all the other subjects that you have. And yeah, good luck with everything. And thank you so much to UBS and our amazing volunteers and all the people at Skyline who helped make this series possible. Thanks so much, everyone.